Good evening, and welcome back to Bedtime and Historian. What does it mean for a child to be chosen not for wealth, not for comfort, but for the weight of an empire that stretches from the misty hills of Britain to the deserts of Syria? In the quiet courtyards of Rome, among marble columns and the steady rhythm of daily ritual, a boy once grew up knowing that his life would not entirely belong to him. He was not born emperor. He was not even born into the direct line of succession, yet the currents of Roman power, slow and deliberate, were already moving around him. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And as always, let me know where you're listening from tonight and what your local time is. It's always remarkable to see how far these quiet journeys travel. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Marcus Aurelius was born in the year 121 AD, during the reign of Emperor Hadrian, at a time when Rome stood confident in its power. His birth name was Marcus Annius Verus. He came into the world not in a palace, but in a wealthy Roman household of Spanish origin. His family had risen through public service and loyalty to the state. His father died when Marcus was still young, leaving the boy to be raised largely by his mother, Domitia Lucilla, a woman known for her seriousness and refinement. From her, he absorbed a respect for order and a quiet discipline that would shape him long before anyone spoke to him about ruling. Rome in his childhood was orderly and impressive. The city's population likely exceeded 1 million. Grain shipments arrived regularly from North Africa and Egypt. The forum bustled with advocates and officials in white togas edged with purple. Public baths steamed from morning until evening, and fountains murmured in courtyards fed by aqueducts stretching across the countryside. The empire was not free of tension, but it was stable, and stability in Rome often meant careful planning at the top. Hadrian, the emperor at the time of Marcus's birth, was a thoughtful and cautious ruler. He travelled extensively across the provinces, strengthening borders rather than expanding them. He admired Greek culture and philosophy, and he valued education. It was Hadrian who first noticed the boy Marcus. Family connections and reputation had already brought Marcus into respectable circles, but Hadrian saw something else, an earnestness perhaps, or a gravity unusual for someone so young. Marcus was serious by temperament. Even as a child, he preferred study over spectacle. Roman boys of noble families were trained early in rhetoric, law, and tradition. They wore the toga praetexta with its purple border, marking them as freeborn citizens of status. They were taught to recite poetry, to argue legal points, to understand the weight of ancestry. Marcus learned all of this, but he also showed interest in something less visible: self-control. It was said that as a youth he slept on a simple pallet rather than a soft bed, until his mother insisted he use at least a modest mattress. He practiced restraint in food and habit. He listened closely to tutors. He did not resist discipline. These were small choices, almost unnoticed at first, but they formed a pattern. Hadrian's succession plan for the empire was deliberate. Roman emperors of this period often adopted their heirs rather than relying strictly on bloodline. Adoption allowed for selection based on perceived ability rather than chance birth. Hadrian first chose Lucius Aelius Caesar as his successor, but Aelius died unexpectedly. The emperor then turned to Antoninus Pius, a respected senator known for calm administration. Antoninus agreed to adopt Marcus, along with another young boy, Lucius Verus, on the condition that Marcus and Lucius would themselves become heirs in time. And so, before he was even a teenager, Marcus found his life redirected. Adoption in Roman aristocratic culture was formal and binding. It reshaped lineage, inheritance, and identity. Marcus became Marcus Aelius Aurelius Verus under Hadrian's arrangement, though his name would later shift again. What mattered most was that he was no longer simply the son of his birth family. He was now part of the imperial household. Antoninus Pius became emperor in 138 AD after Hadrian's death. His reign would last more than 2 decades and would prove to be one of the most peaceful in Roman history. For Marcus, these years were a long apprenticeship. Antoninus did not rush him into public display. Instead, he allowed him to grow steadily into responsibility. Marcus studied law, attended Senate sessions, and observed petitions from citizens. He learned how disputes were resolved, how grain distribution was managed, how taxation flowed from province to capital. Rome's strength depended on administration as much as on legions. In daily life, Marcus's environment was structured but not extravagant. Though he had access to imperial comforts, he maintained modest habits. Meals were simple by aristocratic standards: bread, olives, vegetables, occasional fish or meat. He wore the clothing expected of his rank, but without indulgent excess. His tutors included respected philosophers of the Stoic school. Stoicism taught that external events were beyond one's control, but internal judgment remained within one's power. This idea settled deeply into him. While other young nobles pursued social advancement through charm and networking, Marcus pursued steadiness. He wrote reflections to himself, short notes on conduct and attitude. These were not intended for publication. They were exercises in clarity. He reminded himself not to be distracted by praise, not to resent criticism, not to fear discomfort. These habits formed quietly. Roman society around him was layered and complex. Slaves performed much of the domestic labor in wealthy households. Freedmen managed business affairs. Senators debated policy. Soldiers stationed across the empire guarded frontiers from Britain to the Euphrates. Religious rituals punctuated civic life. Offerings were made to Jupiter, Mars, and household gods. Festivals filled the calendar. Beneath the marble and ceremony lay constant effort to keep the system functioning. Marcus was not isolated from these realities. He observed the legal status of citizens and non-citizens. He saw how provincial governors wielded authority. He understood that stability depended on discipline at every level. Even in times of peace, Rome required careful oversight. Antoninus involved Marcus increasingly in governance. By his early 20s, Marcus held positions that signaled preparation for supreme authority. He was named consul, a prestigious office. He accompanied Antoninus in reviewing official matters. Yet there was no visible impatience in him. He did not rush toward power. During these formative years, Marcus also married Faustina the Younger, Antoninus's daughter. The marriage reinforced succession plans and tied him more closely to the ruling family. Domestic life for an imperial household was both personal and political. Children would strengthen legitimacy. The couple would eventually have many children, though not all would survive to adulthood, a common sorrow in ancient families. As Marcus matured, Rome continued its steady course. The legions were disciplined, trade routes thrived, roads connected distant provinces. Roman citizenship carried privileges and responsibilities. The empire's scale required constant communication through letters and messengers travelling across land and sea. In the evenings, Marcus often read or wrote. Greek literature, especially the works of earlier philosophers, influenced him deeply. He admired Socrates for endurance and Epictetus for practical wisdom. He reminded himself that luxury could soften character. He practiced gratitude for mentors. He noted his own shortcomings without harshness. His temperament was not dramatic. He did not seek applause. Those around him observed his seriousness, sometimes mistaking it for melancholy. Yet it was not sadness. It was attention. He paid attention to himself and to the world. By the time Antoninus Pius entered the later years of his reign, Marcus was fully integrated into imperial duties. He attended council meetings, examined reports from governors, and prepared for military command, though he had not yet faced a major campaign. Peace, however, can be fragile. The empire's borders were vast, and distant tensions could travel inward. Marcus did not yet know that plague and prolonged warfare would one day define his reign. In his youth, Rome felt durable. The Danube frontier was guarded. The eastern provinces were watchful but stable. Grain stores were sufficient. The city's monuments stood polished and secure. He also did not yet know that his private reflections, written as exercises in self-discipline, would survive long after statues of him weathered. At this stage, he was still learning how to govern himself before governing others. Antoninus Pius died in 161 AD after a long illness. His passing was calm, without upheaval. Marcus, now in his late 30s, was prepared to assume full authority. The transition was orderly, as Hadrian had intended decades earlier. But that belongs to the next chapter of his life. For now, in these early years, what defined Marcus Aurelius was not power, but preparation. He lived inside a system carefully arranged by older men who believed in stability over spectacle. He absorbed their habits, their patience, their caution. He developed an inward steadiness that would soon be tested. The city around him continued its daily rhythm, vendors arranging produce at dawn, senators adjusting togas before debate, children reciting lessons in shaded courtyards, soldiers drilling in distant camps. Rome was immense and ordinary at once, both marble grandeur and human routine. Marcus moved through it quietly, aware that his name carried expectation. He was neither hurried nor idle. He was learning how to carry weight before the weight fully arrived. In these formative decades, no one could yet measure how he would respond to crisis. They could only observe his habits, restraint, study, endurance. The empire he inherited would not remain untouched by hardship, but the boy chosen under Hadrian had grown into a man who understood that leadership began with the discipline of the self. Antoninus Pius did not believe in dramatic displays of authority, and under his steady rule the empire moved forward with the quiet assurance of habit. For Marcus Aurelius, now fully adopted into the imperial line, these were the years of discipline that would shape the rest of his life. He did not awaken one morning to the sudden realization that he would govern Rome. Instead, the knowledge settled into him gradually, reinforced by daily practice. His education was broad, but not ornamental. Roman aristocratic boys were trained in rhetoric because public speech shaped political power. Marcus learned how to argue a case before imagined judges, how to structure a legal defense, how to present a policy without provoking resistance. Yet while rhetoric taught him how to persuade others, philosophy taught him how to restrain himself. His tutors included Stoic thinkers who emphasized that emotion, when unchecked, could cloud judgment. He practiced examining his own reactions before responding. He rose early. Roman mornings began before the heat built in the city. Clients would gather at the homes of powerful patrons, waiting to request assistance or offer support. Marcus observed these rituals of patronage, understanding that influence was woven through personal loyalty as much as official decree. In the atrium of his residence, petitions would be read, matters reviewed. He learned how to distinguish urgent concerns from trivial complaints. Clothing in these years reflected both rank and responsibility. As he matured, Marcus exchanged the toga of youth for the toga virilis, symbolizing adult citizenship. When he served as consul, he wore garments appropriate to the dignity of office. Yet those who lived near him noted that he did not indulge in excessive luxury. He kept his appearance correct but simple. His marriage to Faustina deepened during this period. Court life was not a constant celebration. It involved managing estates, overseeing servants, arranging marriages for relatives, and attending religious observances. Faustina bore children at intervals, and though many did not survive infancy, each birth brought both hope and anxiety. Roman families were accustomed to loss, but repetition did not make it lighter. Marcus approached fatherhood with seriousness, mindful that some of his children might one day carry imperial expectation. Outside the palace walls, Rome remained orderly. Markets offered bread, cheese, lentils, and imported spices. Artisans shaped metal and leather. Public entertainments continued in amphitheatres and circuses. The empire's roads allowed news to travel swiftly, though not instantly. Reports from governors described harvests, legal disputes, and occasional unrest. Marcus reviewed such communications carefully, aware that even minor disturbances could signal deeper strain. Antoninus Pius rarely left Italy during his reign. He preferred to govern through correspondence and trusted officials rather than personal inspection of distant provinces. Marcus studied this method. Stability, he saw, did not always require movement. It required consistent attention. The treasury was managed cautiously. Public works were maintained without extravagance. The army was supplied without unnecessary aggression. Yet Marcus did not grow complacent. His philosophical readings reminded him that external calm could change without warning. He practiced imagining adversity so that he would not be unprepared if it arrived. This habit was not pessimism, it was rehearsal. In his private notes, he listed qualities he admired in others: patience, fairness, endurance. He also listed traits he wished to avoid: anger, vanity, impatience. As the years progressed, Antoninus entrusted him with increasing responsibility. Marcus presided over legal cases, sitting in judgment for hours as disputes were presented. He learned to weigh evidence, to listen without interruption, to decide without resentment. Justice in Rome was a public performance, but also a private burden. A mistaken ruling could ripple outward through families and communities. Lucius Verus, adopted alongside Marcus, grew up in the same imperial framework. Their temperaments differed. Lucius was more inclined towards social ease and display. Marcus did not resent this contrast. He observed it. The adoption arrangement made them future co-rulers. Marcus understood that partnership would require patience. Religious obligations also formed part of his routine. As a member of Rome's elite, he participated in ceremonies honoring traditional gods. Sacrifices were conducted with precision. Priests interpreted omens. Though Stoic philosophy emphasized rational order, Roman civic life required adherence to ritual. Marcus did not dismiss these customs. He saw them as part of the social fabric that bound citizens together. In the broader empire, provincial cultures continued to flourish. Greek cities preserved their festivals and theatres. Egyptian temples maintained ancient rites. In Gaul and Britain, Roman roads and baths stood beside older traditions. Marcus learned that governing Rome meant accommodating diversity without surrendering unity. The emperor's authority had to be visible yet not oppressive. As Antoninus aged, Marcus spent more time at his side. The emperor's health declined gradually. Marcus observed how illness narrowed a ruler's physical strength, but not necessarily his clarity of mind. Decisions still needed to be made. Petitions still arrived. Grain shipments still required coordination. Watching this, Marcus absorbed a final lesson. Leadership did not pause for personal discomfort. During these years, Marcus also refined his inner habits. He reminded himself to accept correction. When praised, he cautioned himself against pride. When frustrated, he practiced calm response. He viewed each irritation as an opportunity to test self-control. This approach, repeated daily, strengthened him quietly. The city itself offered constant reminders of impermanence. Fires occasionally broke out in crowded districts. Building repairs were common. Statues weathered. Markets fluctuated in price. Even prosperity required vigilance. Marcus did not assume that Rome's dominance was guaranteed. He saw it as the result of sustained effort. In 161 AD, Antoninus Pius fell gravely ill. His final days were orderly. He reportedly gave the imperial password of the watch, equanimity, before dying. Marcus, now approaching 40, assumed the role for which he had been prepared since youth. True to the adoption agreement, he insisted that Lucius Verus share the title of Augustus. This decision reflected both legal arrangement and personal restraint. Marcus did not seek sole authority. The transition of power was calm. The Senate confirmed the new emperors. The army pledged loyalty. Citizens continued their routines. Yet beneath the surface, pressures were forming along distant frontiers. In the east, The Parthian Empire tested Rome's influence. On the northern borders, Germanic tribes observed Roman strength with cautious calculation. Marcus's first act as emperor was not spectacle but continuity. He maintained Antoninus's advisors. He honoured established policies. He reassured the Senate that stability would endure. His temperament remained measured, yet the calm inheritance would soon meet challenge. For now, at the beginning of his reign, Marcus carried into authority the habits forged in youth: early rising, careful reading, disciplined speech, philosophical reflection. He understood that governing others required governing oneself. He had spent decades practicing that principle. Rome did not erupt into celebration at his accession. It adjusted. Officials changed seals, messengers updated titles, coins were struck bearing new likenesses. In workshops, craftsmen engraved the imperial profile. Life continued. Marcus Aurelius stood at the centre of the system not as a conqueror eager for expansion, but as a custodian of order. The education of his early years had not prepared him for glory. It had prepared him for responsibility. The empire, vast and complex, would soon test the depth of that preparation. The world of Antoninus. When Marcus Aurelius stepped fully into adulthood, he did so under the long and steady shadow of Antoninus Pius, a ruler whose greatest achievement was not conquest but continuity. The empire he inherited as heir was not trembling. It was functioning. Roads were maintained. The treasury was solvent. The army was disciplined but not overextended. For Marcus, these years were not marked by crisis but by observation. And observation shaped him more quietly than any battlefield could have done. Antoninus governed from Rome and from his villas in Italy, rather than travelling restlessly across the provinces. This alone distinguished his style from that of Hadrian. Stability, in his view, came from measured administration. Marcus watched as petitions from distant cities arrived, daily requests for tax relief after floods, appeals from provincial councils seeking clarification of law, reports from governors detailing harvest yields and local disputes. Each document was read carefully. Marginal notes were written in controlled script. Decisions were delivered without theatrical flourish. Marcus learned that the machinery of empire was made not only of legions and marble arches, but of paperwork, patience, and precedent. The imperial court under Antoninus was orderly rather than extravagant. Meals were structured and modest by Roman aristocratic standards. Bread, olives, fruit, vegetables, and fish formed the core of daily fare. On formal occasions, roasted meats and imported delicacies appeared, but excess was not the norm. Servants moved quietly. Freedmen managed correspondence and accounts. The emperor's presence did not require constant ceremony. It required attention to duty. Marcus adopted these rhythms naturally. He attended the morning salutatio, where clients and officials presented themselves in respectful sequence. He observed how Antoninus listened without interruption, rarely raising his voice. Authority, he saw, did not need volume. It required consistency. Roman daily life during these decades followed predictable patterns. At dawn, bakers opened their ovens. Merchants arranged stalls along the forum. Senators gathered in curia buildings to debate matters that affected provinces thousands of miles away. The baths filled in the afternoon with conversation, steam, and the scent of oil. In the evenings, households dined and small lamps illuminated courtyards. Marcus did not isolate himself from these patterns. Though imperial life created distance, he remained attentive to the ordinary structures that sustained the city. Grain shipments were vital. North Africa and Egypt supplied the capital's bread. Any disruption could provoke unrest. Antoninus managed these logistics with careful oversight, and Marcus studied the reports closely. In legal matters, Antoninus earned a reputation for fairness. He respected traditional forms but allowed measured flexibility where justice required it. Marcus sat beside him during hearings. He learned to weigh not only written law but human circumstance. A rigid decision could damage trust. A careless one could undermine order. During these years, the empire's frontiers were relatively quiet, yet they were never entirely still. Along the Rhine and Danube rivers, Roman legions maintained watchtowers and forts. Across those borders lived tribes with their own leaders, customs, and ambitions. Trade occurred regularly, but so did tension. Marcus reviewed intelligence reports and logistical summaries. He understood that even peace demanded preparation. The eastern provinces required equal attention. Parthia, Rome's rival in the Near East, remained a formidable power. Diplomatic exchanges alternated between cautious cooperation and guarded rivalry. Antoninus avoided provocation. Marcus observed the delicate balance of deterrence and restraint. Within the imperial household, Marcus's marriage to Faustina matured. She bore children in succession, and the rhythms of pregnancy, birth, and mourning shaped domestic life. Roman aristocratic women were expected to manage estates, oversee servants, and embody family dignity. Faustina fulfilled these roles. Court gossip occasionally circulated, as it always did in centres of power, but Marcus did not allow rumour to distract him from governance. Their surviving children brought both hope and anxiety. Infant mortality remained high even among the elite. Each loss reinforced Marcus's awareness of impermanence. He did not express grief in dramatic gestures. Instead, he folded it inward, examining his reaction, reminding himself of the Stoic teaching that attachment must coexist with acceptance. The intellectual atmosphere of Rome during Antoninus's reign remained vibrant. Greek philosophy was studied widely among the educated class. Marcus continued to read and correspond with teachers who reinforced his commitment to self-discipline. He admired Epictetus's insistence that freedom lay in controlling one's own judgment. He reminded himself that public honour was fleeting, that criticism was inevitable, and that character required vigilance. Meanwhile, public entertainment continued. Chariot races in the Circus Maximus drew immense crowds. Gladiatorial games, though brutal, remained popular. Marcus attended such events when required. Though he did not indulge in their spectacle, he maintained composure, aware that emperors were watched closely in every public setting. Antoninus relied heavily on the Senate, preserving its dignity even while maintaining ultimate authority. Marcus observed this balance carefully. Alienating the Senate could create instability. Flattering it excessively could weaken executive clarity. Governance in Rome required cooperation between institutions. Financial policy during these years remained conservative. Antoninus avoided unnecessary military campaigns that would drain the treasury. Infrastructure projects were maintained but not expanded recklessly. Provincial taxation remained steady. Marcus understood that fiscal stability underpinned military strength and public trust. Outside Rome, provincial cities thrived under Roman administration. In Asia Minor, theatres and libraries flourished. In Gaul, agricultural estates expanded. In Britain, forts stood against cold winds and occasional tribal resistance. Marcus read dispatches from these regions, building a mental map of the empire's complexity. The imperial court was not without tension. Advisors competed for influence. Provincial governors sought favour. Ambition existed even with instability. Marcus learned to evaluate character carefully. He valued moderation in others, wary of those who displayed excessive flattery. As Antoninus aged, he relied increasingly on Marcus to conduct formal duties. Marcus presided over Senate meetings, signed edicts, and reviewed military appointments. Each task reinforced his role not as an observer, but as a participant in governance. The broader Roman population experienced Antoninus's reign as a time of relative peace. Markets were stable, roads remained safe for trade, religious festivals continued without disruption. The sense of continuity strengthened loyalty to the imperial house. Yet beneath this calm surface, demographic and military pressures quietly accumulated. Population growth along frontier regions increased competition for land. Germanic tribes formed shifting alliances. In the east, Parthian influence extended toward Armenia. Marcus understood that peace might not endure indefinitely. Antoninus himself modelled a form of leadership based on patience rather than ambition. He did not seek dramatic expansion. He prioritized fairness in law and moderation in policy. Marcus internalized these habits deeply. When he later faced war and plague, his instinct would not be panic but steadiness. The final years of Antoninus's life brought gradual physical decline. Marcus remained attentive, handling more administrative responsibilities as the emperor's strength diminished. There was no abrupt collapse of order. The transition unfolded as deliberately as the adoption that had placed Marcus in line decades earlier. When Antoninus died in 161 AD, the empire did not erupt in confusion. The Senate confirmed Marcus and Lucius Verus as joint emperors. Coins were minted bearing their images. Oaths of loyalty were renewed. Marcus entered full authority, with the weight of long preparation behind him. He had not been shaped by crisis, but by observation. He had learned governance through continuity. The world of Antoninus had given him a model of restrained power, fiscal prudence, and institutional respect. He would soon face circumstances very different from those of his mentor. But the habits formed during these decades, measured judgment, administrative patience, philosophical reflection remained embedded within him. The empire he inherited at Antoninus's death appeared stable and secure. Yet history rarely allows calm to last without test. The steady world Marcus had studied so carefully was about to change. Marriage and household of power. Marcus Aurelius entered the centre of Roman power not as a solitary figure, but as the head of a growing household whose rhythms were both intimate and political. His marriage to Faustina the Younger, daughter of Antoninus Pius, had begun years before he became emperor, yet its full weight became clearer once he assumed authority. In Rome, family was not separate from governance. The stability of the imperial house influenced public confidence as surely as military success. Faustina had grown up within the imperial circle. She understood court life from childhood, the formal processions, the careful presentation of dignity, the constant awareness that every gesture could be interpreted. Her role as Augusta after 161 AD required visibility. She appeared beside Marcus, at ceremonies on coinage and in public acts of benefaction. Images of her were distributed across the empire, reinforcing continuity and legitimacy. Their marriage produced many children, though only a few survived to adulthood. The nursery within the imperial residence was rarely quiet. Nurses and attendants managed feeding, bathing, and early instruction. Roman aristocratic children were often raised by trusted caretakers, yet Marcus took interest in their education. Tutors were selected with care. Instruction in Greek and Latin literature began early. Physical training accompanied intellectual development. Infant mortality remained common even among the elite. Each illness introduced uncertainty. Roman medicine relied on herbal remedies, dietary adjustments, and cautious observation. Physicians moved carefully through the palace corridors, balancing hope with realism. When a child did not survive, the household entered a period of controlled mourning. Marcus did not withdraw from public duties during such times, but he felt the repetition of loss. His private writings reveal reminders to himself that nature follows its course without malice. Faustina's reputation in later historical sources would become entangled in rumour. Some ancient writers suggested impropriety or indulgence. Yet contemporary evidence during Marcus's lifetime portrays her as active in charitable efforts and loyal to her role. She accompanied Marcus on military campaigns later in life, earning the title Mother of the Camps. In these early years of shared rule, she fulfilled domestic and ceremonial responsibilities steadily. Life within the imperial residence followed structured routines. At dawn, officials and petitioners gathered. Marcus reviewed documents while scribes prepared responses. Midday often included legal hearings or Senate consultations. Evenings were reserved for family meals or philosophical reading. The household staff functioned as a small administrative network. Freedmen managed correspondence, stewards oversaw finances, and guards maintained security. The physical spaces of imperial life reflected Roman architecture's balance between grandeur and practicality. Courtyards admitted light and air. Mosaic floors depicted mythological scenes. Water flowed through fountains fed by aqueducts. Kitchens operated efficiently, producing meals for both the family and numerous attendants. Storage rooms held grain, oil, and wine in large ceramic vessels. Beyond the palace, Rome itself continued in motion. The Colosseum would not be completed until a later reign, but public spectacles remained central to civic life. The Circus Maximus hosted chariot races that attracted immense crowds divided into factions: blues, greens, reds, and whites. Senators discussed provincial matters in marble halls. Artisans shaped statues that would travel to distant cities as imperial gifts. Marcus understood that domestic stability reinforced political authority. The image of a harmonious family suggested continuity. Children represented future succession. Public generosity from the imperial household donations to the poor. Funding for public works strengthened loyalty. His relationship with Lucius Verus, co-emperor, also influenced household dynamics. Lucius maintained a more outwardly social presence, enjoying entertainments and public display to a greater degree. Marcus did not compete in such arenas. Instead, he maintained focus on administration and law. Their partnership, though unequal in temperament, functioned without visible rivalry during these early years. The empire's social hierarchy remained complex. Senators held vast estates worked by enslaved labourers. Urban plebeians relied on grain distributions. Freedmen navigated new social positions between servitude and citizenship. Marcus, through policy decisions, affected each layer. He reviewed cases involving the rights of slaves, inheritance disputes, and provincial grievances. His judgments aimed at fairness within Roman legal frameworks. Faustina's role extended beyond motherhood. She participated in religious ceremonies honouring traditional deities. Festivals such as the Paralia and Saturnalia punctuated the year. During these observances, the imperial family's presence affirmed shared tradition. Sacrificial rituals were conducted precisely. Priests recited formal prayers. Citizens gathered in orderly crowds. The imperial children's upbringing carried expectations of discipline. Young Commodus, born in 161 AD, entered the world shortly after Marcus's accession. As a son born to a reigning emperor, his status differed from Marcus's own childhood. Marcus had been chosen. Commodus was born into succession. This distinction would matter later. For now, he was an infant in a carefully managed nursery. Education within the palace balanced rigour and exposure. Tutors emphasised moral instruction alongside grammar and rhetoric. Marcus believed that character must precede authority. He encouraged simplicity in habit, even within privilege. Soft bedding and rich garments were available, yet moderation was encouraged. Outside the capital, signs of tension began to emerge. In the east, the Parthian Empire made movements that threatened Roman client kingdoms. News travelled through official channels. Reports were discussed in council chambers. The calm domestic routines of Rome existed alongside strategic calculations far beyond Italy's borders. Marcus divided his attention carefully. Morning hours addressed governance. Afternoon consultations reviewed military intelligence. Evening reflections allowed him to assess his own responses. He did not separate personal life from imperial duty. Both required vigilance. Faustina's presence provided continuity during transitions. She represented the previous emperor's lineage as well as the current regime's future. Coins bearing her image circulated widely, reinforcing imperial unity. The distribution of such imagery was not accidental. It shaped perception across distant provinces. Within the palace walls, celebrations accompanied surviving children's birthdays. Tutors presented progress reports. Physicians monitored health. The imperial household resembled many Roman aristocratic families in structure, though amplified in scale. Servants maintained clothing, prepared baths, and ensured security. The number of individuals dependent on imperial employment was considerable. Marcus's philosophical commitments did not isolate him from affection. He valued his children's development. He sought to model patience. Yet he remained aware that attachment could not prevent loss. Stoicism did not remove emotion. It framed it within acceptance. As co-emperors, Marcus and Lucius shared titles and responsibilities. Lucius would soon lead campaigns in the east, leaving Marcus in Rome to manage administration. Their complementary roles reflected the practical demands of empire. No single ruler could oversee every frontier simultaneously. The streets of Rome during these years reflected prosperity. Markets offered imported goods from across the Mediterranean. Sculptors crafted portraits in marble. Public baths expanded social interaction. Yet, prosperity required constant maintenance. Grain supplies depended on stable sea routes. Provincial governors needed oversight. Marcus's household functioned as both family and symbol. Each child born represented continuity. Each public appearance reinforced authority. Each private decision carried potential public consequence. In these years before war and plague transformed the empire's mood, Marcus experienced the balance of domestic life and imperial responsibility. The nursery's quiet sounds coexisted with Senate debates. The rhythm of household meals paralleled the rhythm of legal hearings. Shared throne, gathering storms. When Antoninus Pius died in 161 AD, the Senate confirmed Marcus Aurelius as emperor without resistance. What surprised many observers, however, was Marcus's immediate insistence that Lucius Verus share equal authority. The arrangement had been anticipated in Hadrian's adoption plan, but Marcus had the option to rule alone. Instead, he chose partnership. This decision revealed several layers of his character. He respected precedent. He avoided appearing ambitious. He recognized that governing a vast empire required division of labor. Rome stretched from the Atlantic to Mesopotamia, from the forests of Germania to the deserts of North Africa. Communication, though efficient by ancient standards, still required weeks or months. Shared authority provided flexibility. Lucius Verus, younger and more inclined toward visible leadership, accepted the Eastern Command soon after their accession. Trouble had arisen in Armenia, a buffer kingdom between Rome and Parthia. The Parthian king had installed his own candidate on the Armenian throne, challenging Roman influence. Such actions could not be ignored without weakening Rome's reputation among allies and rivals alike. Marcus remained in Rome to oversee administration, while Lucius prepared to depart eastward. The division was practical. Marcus managed legal reforms, fiscal oversight, and Senate relations. Lucius would supervise the military campaign. The arrangement also reflected temperament. Marcus preferred careful review of documentation and philosophical discipline. Lucius appeared more comfortable with the pageantry of command. Before Lucius departed, preparations filled the capital. Troops assembled. Supply routes were mapped. Armour and weapons were inspected. Grain and fodder were calculated for long marches. Military logistics required precision. A Roman legion on campaign was a mobile community of thousands of soldiers, engineers, physicians, craftsmen, and support staff. Ensuring their efficiency demanded coordination between provincial governors and central administration. Marcus attended to these details without spectacle. He reviewed financial allocations for the campaign. He examined reports from the eastern provinces describing terrain, fortifications, and alliances. He met with senior commanders, confirming loyalty and strategy. Lucius's journey east signaled a shift in imperial focus. For years, Rome had enjoyed relative calm. Now war would test its resources. Though Marcus did not personally lead the Eastern campaign, he remained fully engaged in its progress. Dispatches arrived regularly, describing movements near the Euphrates and the recapture of Armenian territory. Rome's population responded to news of war with mixed emotion. Victories inspired confidence, setbacks produced concern. Markets adjusted prices cautiously, anticipating increased military expenditure. The Senate debated appropriations. Public rituals invoked divine favour for the legions. Within the imperial household, life continued in structured rhythm. Faustina oversaw domestic responsibilities, while Marcus balanced governance with family life. Children grew. Tutors instructed them in literature and discipline. Commodus, still young, observed a father who carried authority without visible agitation. The Eastern campaign progressed gradually. Roman forces regained control in Armenia and advanced into Mesopotamia. Cities such as Seleucia and Ctesiphon came under Roman pressure. Victory seemed assured. Yet beneath the surface of military success, an unseen danger travelled with the returning troops. In 165 AD, reports emerged of a devastating illness spreading among soldiers in the east. The disease, later known as the Antonine Plague, likely smallpox or measles, moved swiftly through crowded camps. Symptoms included fever, rash, and weakness. Mortality rates were high. Physicians struggled to understand its cause. The concept of contagion was not scientifically articulated, but observers recognized patterns of spread. As soldiers returned westward, the illness travelled with them. What had begun as a distant military complication soon entered Roman cities. In crowded urban districts, disease moved rapidly. Rome, with its dense population and frequent gatherings, proved vulnerable. Marcus faced a challenge unlike any he had prepared for. War required strategy and discipline. Plague demanded endurance and adaptability. Grain supplies needed protection. Public order required reassurance. Burial practices became strained as deaths increased. Lucius Verus returned from the east in 166 AD, bringing both military success and the epidemic's shadow. The co-emperors confronted crisis together. Temples filled with supplicants seeking divine intervention. Physicians applied treatments based on prevailing medical theory, balancing humours, prescribing herbal remedies, but their effectiveness remained limited. Marcus responded by maintaining administrative stability. He ensured grain distributions continued. He avoided panic-driven decrees. He reinforced military readiness along frontiers weakened by loss of manpower. The empire's strength depended not only on surviving the disease, but on preventing opportunistic incursions by external enemies. The Danube frontier soon required attention. Germanic tribes, observing Roman vulnerability, increased pressure along the border. Raids intensified. Marcus could no longer remain solely in Rome. The philosopher emperor would have to lead troops personally. Before departing north, he ensured domestic order. Faustina remained a stabilizing presence in the capital. The Senate cooperated in emergency measures. Financial reserves were mobilized to fund defense. Marcus's decision to share power with Lucius now proved practical. While Marcus prepared to confront threats in the north, Lucius assisted in administration and morale. Their partnership, though occasionally strained by differing habits, functioned in necessity. The emperor's daily routine adjusted to crisis. Reports arrived not only of legal disputes and tax matters, but of casualty numbers and border skirmishes. He read them with controlled focus. Emotional reaction would not solve the problem. Action, measured and sustained, would. Roman society adapted as best it could. Markets operated, though cautiously. Religious processions sought protection. Public entertainment diminished during periods of severe outbreak. Families managed illness within crowded insular apartments and suburban villas alike. Marcus's philosophical discipline faced practical test. He reminded himself that events unfold according to nature's laws. Fear could not alter them. He wrote reflections to steady his thoughts, reinforcing the idea that virtue lay in responding well, not in controlling outcomes. The shared throne had begun in calm continuity. Within 5 years, it confronted war, epidemic, and frontier instability. Marcus's preparation under Antoninus had taught him patience. Now patience became endurance. The empire did not collapse under these pressures. Its administrative systems, though strained, remained functional. Legions reorganized. Governors coordinated relief. Civic leaders maintained order. Marcus Aurelius, once a studious heir observing governance from the side of his adoptive father, now stood fully exposed to the demands of leadership in crisis. The quiet discipline of his youth had become essential. The partnership with Lucius Verus, chosen deliberately, allowed flexibility in response. The gathering storms of plague and war would define the next phase of his life. The philosopher who valued inward control would soon spend years along cold northern rivers, commanding legions under constant strain. Yet even amid escalating crisis, Marcus maintained the steady posture formed in youth. He neither dramatized nor minimized events. He acted. War in the East. The Eastern War that unfolded under the joint rule of Marcus Aurelius and Lucius Verus did not begin with spectacle in Rome. It began with intelligence reports measured, factual, and increasingly concerning. Armenia, long a buffer state between Rome and the Parthian Empire, had become the immediate point of friction. When the Parthian king Vologases IV installed his own ruler there, Rome's diplomatic influence was directly challenged. Such interference threatened not merely territory, but prestige. In the Roman world, reputation reinforced authority. If Rome appeared passive, its alliances elsewhere could weaken. Lucius Verus was assigned the Eastern Command in 162 AD. Though some later historians questioned his military seriousness, contemporary logistics demonstrate that the campaign was methodically prepared. Legions from the Danube and other regions were transferred east. Supply chains were reorganized. Provincial governors coordinated troop movements. Marcus remained in Rome, overseeing the broader structure of governance and ensuring that the Eastern War did not destabilize domestic administration. The eastern provinces differed significantly from Italy. Syria, a key Roman stronghold, was urban, multilingual, and commercially active. Greek culture dominated its cities, while local traditions persisted in rural areas. The Euphrates River marked not only a geographic boundary, but a strategic line of tension. Roman forts and roads stretched across this terrain, linking Antioch, Edessa, and other vital centres. Lucius established his headquarters in Antioch, one of the wealthiest cities in the eastern Mediterranean. From there, commanders directed operations into Armenia and Mesopotamia. The campaign itself unfolded gradually rather than dramatically. Roman forces reclaimed Armenia, installing a client king aligned with Roman interests. Engineering units repaired roads and fortifications. Military discipline, refined over centuries, provided Rome with structural advantage. Marcus followed these developments through written dispatches. Couriers travelled thousands of miles carrying updates. Reports included casualty lists, troop morale assessments, and logistical concerns. Marcus read them with careful attention. War was not merely a matter of battlefield outcome. It was a test of endurance and coordination. The Roman army at this time was a complex institution. A legion consisted of roughly 5,000 to 6,000 soldiers, supported by auxiliary units recruited from across the empire. These auxiliaries included archers from Syria, cavalry from Gaul, and infantry from the Balkans. Military camps functioned as small cities, with standardized layouts, workshops, granaries, and medical tents. Order was central. Soldiers drilled daily, maintained equipment meticulously, and adhered to strict discipline. As the campaign progressed into Mesopotamia, Roman forces captured major cities including Seleucia and Ctesiphon. These victories reinforced Roman dominance. Loot and tribute flowed westward. Official announcements in Rome celebrated success, though Marcus avoided excessive triumphalism. He understood that war could shift quickly. Within the eastern camps, however, another force had begun its quiet advance. In 165 AD, soldiers reported symptoms of a severe illness. High fever, persistent cough, skin eruptions and exhaustion spread through tightly packed quarters. Medical practitioners applied prevailing theories of humoral imbalance, recommending dietary adjustments and herbal remedies. Yet the disease did not recede. The nature of the Antonine Plague remains debated among modern scholars. but contemporary accounts suggest it was highly contagious. Troops weakened rapidly, mortality increased. Camp physicians struggled to isolate the sick, but movement between units facilitated transmission. As returning legions began their journey back toward the western provinces, the illness travelled with them. Roman roads, which had long served commerce and military efficiency, now became conduits for contagion. By 166 AD, reports of widespread illness emerged in Asia Minor, Greece, and eventually Italy. In Rome, Marcus confronted the first signs of epidemic with measured response. Public health systems in antiquity were limited. Aqueducts ensured water supply. Sewage networks reduced waste accumulation. Yet urban density created vulnerability. Funeral processions became more frequent. Markets thinned as families remained indoors. Marcus resisted panic-driven policies. He coordinated grain distributions to prevent shortages. He ensured that army recruitment compensated for losses. Military readiness could not lapse, particularly along the Danube frontier where Germanic tribes observed Rome's strain. Lucius Verus returned to Italy in 166 AD after the Eastern victories. Though the campaign had succeeded militarily, the cost was becoming visible. The co-emperors celebrated a joint triumph in Rome, a ceremonial acknowledgement of victory. Processions moved through the city, displaying spoils and captives. Yet beneath the formal celebration lay awareness of the spreading disease. The triumph did not signal rest. The Danube frontier soon erupted into intensified conflict. Germanic tribes, including the Marcomanni and Quadi, crossed into Roman territory. Villages in northern Italy experienced raids. For the first time in generations, Italian soil itself felt direct threat from external enemies. Marcus recognized that the center of gravity had shifted from the east to the north. The empire's military resources, already weakened by plague, required reorganization. Recruitment expanded to include slaves and gladiators in some cases, an unusual measure reflecting manpower shortages. As preparations for northern campaigns accelerated, Marcus spent increasing time reviewing troop deployments and frontier reports. The philosopher emperor, once primarily an administrator, prepared to lead military operations personally. He did not abandon Rome impulsively. He ensured domestic governance remained functional before departing. The Eastern War, though concluded with victory, had changed the empire's trajectory. It demonstrated that Rome remained capable of projecting power deep into Mesopotamia. Yet it also revealed vulnerability. The Antonine Plague would persist intermittently for years, reducing population and straining labour supply. Economic effects soon became evident. Agricultural production declined in regions heavily affected by illness. Tax revenues fluctuated. Some estates lacked sufficient labourers. Prices in markets adjusted accordingly. Marcus responded by avoiding drastic fiscal measures. Stability required gradual adaptation rather than sudden reform. Within the imperial household, concern accompanied public duty. Faustina oversaw charitable distributions to affected communities. Temples organized rituals seeking divine protection. Philosophers debated the nature of suffering and fate. Marcus continued writing private reflections, reminding himself that events beyond his control required disciplined acceptance. The Roman public, accustomed to imperial security, confronted uncertainty. Yet Rome's institutional resilience proved strong. Governors maintained order in provinces. Legions restructured along the Danube. Civic leaders coordinated relief efforts. Lucius Verus died in 169 AD, while travelling with Marcus toward the northern frontier, reportedly from illness. His death ended the co-emperorship. Marcus became sole ruler at a moment of intensified crisis. The partnership that had begun in optimism now concluded in shared hardship. The Eastern War, though successful in territorial terms, marked the beginning of a more demanding era. Marcus had inherited stability. Now he governed amid epidemic and invasion. The structures he had studied under Antoninus were being tested. He did not react with spectacle or dramatic proclamation. He continued the habits formed decades earlier, reading reports carefully, consulting advisors, maintaining composure. The war in the East had proven Rome's strength. The plague had revealed its fragility. As Marcus turned his attention northward to confront Germanic incursions, he carried with him lessons from the Eastern campaign. Victory did not eliminate vulnerability. Discipline must endure even when triumph fades. The Roman Empire, vast and interconnected, moved forward under his steady guidance. Roads remained active, markets reopened cautiously, legions regrouped. Marcus Aurelius, once the quiet student under Hadrian's gaze, now faced a reality far more complex than the orderly world of Antoninus. The Eastern War had expanded Rome's reach and exposed its limits. The emperor's task was no longer simply to preserve inherited calm, but to sustain coherence through disruption. The Antonine Plague. By the late 160 SAD, the illness that had first appeared among soldiers in the eastern provinces no longer seemed like a temporary misfortune carried home from distant campaigns. It had settled into the empire itself. The Antonine Plague, as later generations would call it, spread through cities, villages, military camps, and estates with a persistence that unsettled even seasoned administrators. Marcus Aurelius confronted not a single wave of disease, but recurring outbreaks over years. Ancient sources describe fevers that lingered, eruptions on the skin, and weakness so severe that daily labour became impossible. Mortality affected both urban centres and rural districts. In Rome, funeral pyres burned more frequently. In provincial towns, civic leaders struggled to maintain essential services as craftsmen and labourers fell ill. The Roman world had never been immune to disease. Earlier epidemics had occurred, and medical theory offered frameworks for understanding illness in terms of bodily humours and environmental imbalance. Physicians like Galen, who would later treat Marcus himself, emphasised observation and regimen. Yet the scale of this outbreak exceeded ordinary expectation. Marcus's response was administrative rather than theatrical. He ensured that grain distributions continued despite reduced manpower in ports and warehouses. The Annona, Rome's grain supply system, remained critical to preventing unrest. Ships still arrived from Egypt and North Africa. Though crew losses complicated schedules, harbour officials coordinated unloading with caution, aware that sailors themselves could carry infection. The army suffered significantly. Legions stationed along the Danube frontier reported decreased numbers. Replacements were recruited from across the empire, including regions less affected at first by the disease. Marcus authorized the enlistment of freed slaves and even gladiators, a practical decision reflecting urgent need. Training intensified to compensate for reduced experience among new recruits. Economic consequences became visible. Agricultural estates struggled with labour shortages. Some fields went partially uncultivated. Urban workshops reduced production. Tax revenues fluctuated, though the imperial treasury, carefully maintained under Antoninus, provided buffer capacity. Marcus resisted imposing severe new taxes during peak outbreak periods, recognizing that overburdening a weakened population could destabilize loyalty. Religious life intensified. Citizens turned to traditional rituals seeking relief. Temples conducted sacrifices to Jupiter, Apollo, and other deities associated with healing and protection. Foreign cults also attracted attention. In times of crisis, spiritual diversity expanded as individuals sought reassurance. Marcus did not suppress these expressions. He understood that public morale depended partly on shared belief. Funeral practices adapted under strain. Cremation remained common, but capacity became limited in heavily affected regions. Families performed rites with reduced ceremony when necessary. Public spaces occasionally displayed notices warning of contagion, though the concept lacked modern medical clarity. Isolation was practiced informally, with households attempting to separate the sick when possible. Marcus continued to travel north to confront Germanic incursions while managing epidemic response. His life now alternated between frontier encampments and administrative centres. Communication required reliable couriers, who themselves risked exposure. He relied on written reports more heavily than ever. In his private reflections, later compiled as the Meditations, Marcus addressed mortality directly. He reminded himself that death was natural, neither shameful nor unexpected. He urged himself to perform duty without complaint. These notes were not intended for public reassurance. They were tools of self-discipline. He did not deny grief. He contextualized it. The plague affected all social classes. Senators lost heirs, soldiers lost comrades, merchants lost partners. The universality of vulnerability reinforced Marcus's stoic conviction that external events do not discriminate according to status. What remained within control was response. Urban life adjusted gradually. Markets reopened between waves of illness. Artisans resumed work. Public entertainments returned cautiously. The Roman appetite for routine proved resilient. Infrastructure such as aqueducts and baths continued operation, though maintenance crews sometimes operated understaffed. Medical practitioners attempted varied treatments. Herbal preparations, bloodletting, dietary restrictions, and environmental adjustments were prescribed. Some recoveries occurred, offering hope. Yet recurrence undermined confidence in any single remedy. Marcus faced criticism from some quarters for not attributing the plague to specific divine displeasure or moral failing. His philosophical outlook emphasized natural causes rather than supernatural punishment. Nonetheless, he did not publicly challenge religious interpretation. He allowed rituals to proceed, understanding their social function. The Danube frontier demanded sustained military attention. Germanic tribes pressed southward, at times crossing into Roman territory. Marcus established long-term military presence along the border. Camps expanded into semi-permanent installations. Winter conditions along the river were harsh. Soldiers endured cold, limited supplies, and ongoing disease risk. Despite these pressures, the empire did not fracture. Provincial governors maintained communication. Tax collection, though reduced in volume, remained structured. The Senate cooperated in emergency funding measures. Civic elites in cities contributed resources for relief efforts. Faustina accompanied Marcus on portions of the northern campaigns. Her presence among troops earned respect and strengthened morale. She supervised charitable initiatives supporting soldiers' families. Court life adapted to frontier conditions. Tents and wooden structures replaced marble halls, but administrative order remained. By the early 170 CES, the plague had reduced the empire's population significantly, though precise numbers remain uncertain. Some historians estimate mortality rates reaching millions across decades. For Marcus, the figures translated into tangible administrative challenges: depleted legions, reduced agricultural output, strained urban services. He did not respond with despair. Instead, he emphasized continuity. New recruits were trained, vacant offices were filled, infrastructure repairs continued. The empire's resilience depended on consistent leadership. In Rome itself, public sentiment fluctuated between anxiety and adaptation. Citizens accustomed to imperial prosperity confronted vulnerability. Yet the long tradition of Roman discipline, military, civic, familial, provided foundation for recovery. Marcus's philosophical practice deepened during these years. He reminded himself daily that reputation, fear, and bodily health were transient. Virtue, defined as rational and just action, remained constant. These reflections sustained him through repetitive strain rather than sudden catastrophe. The Antonine Plague did not end abruptly. It receded in phases, reappeared in clusters, and lingered over years. Its presence altered demographic patterns, labour markets, and military structure, yet it did not erase the empire's administrative coherence. Marcus Aurelius, facing epidemic and invasion simultaneously, demonstrated a form of leadership grounded in steadiness rather than dramatic proclamation. He neither exaggerated success nor concealed hardship. He adjusted policies incrementally, maintaining focus on structural stability. The philosopher emperor's education under Antoninus had emphasized fiscal prudence and measured governance. Now those habits sustained Rome through biological crisis. Grain still arrived. Courts still functioned, legions still patrolled. As the plague's intensity fluctuated, Marcus prepared for sustained engagement along the northern frontier. The next phase of his life would unfold far from Rome's marble forums, in the colder air beside the Danube, where war and recovery would intersect. Pressure along the Danube. While the Antonine plague continued its uneven course across the empire, the northern frontier hardened into the central arena of Marcus Aurelius's reign. The Danube River, wide and cold, marked not only a geographic boundary, but a line between two worlds. On its southern bank stood Roman forts, stone-built and methodical. Beyond it lived a shifting constellation of Germanic tribes, Marcomanni, Quadi, Vandals, and others whose political structures were less centralized but no less determined. The disturbances along this frontier were not entirely new. Border tension had always been part of Rome's reality. Trade moved across the river as well as raiding parties. Tribal leaders negotiated with Roman officials, sometimes accepting subsidies in exchange for peace. Yet in the late 160 CES, demographic pressure and opportunity converged. The plague had reduced Roman troop strength. Internal migrations among tribes pushed groups southward. Alliances formed and dissolved rapidly. In 166 and 167 AD, incursions intensified. Tribal groups crossed the Danube in greater numbers than usual. Some settlements in Pannonia and Noricum were attacked. Reports reached Rome describing farms burned and garrisons tested. Marcus, already engaged in epidemic management, faced the necessity of sustained military presence. Unlike the Eastern War, which Lucius Verus had commanded, the northern conflict required Marcus himself to take the field. He travelled to the frontier, establishing headquarters near Carnuntum and other strategic points. The emperor's presence among the legions served multiple purposes: coordination, morale, and symbolic reassurance. Life in the frontier camps differed sharply from life in Rome. Wooden palisades surrounded orderly rows of tents or barracks. The air carried the scent of damp earth, leather, and smoke. Soldiers rose at dawn, drilled in formation, repaired fortifications, and maintained equipment. Discipline remained strict, despite reduced numbers. Marcus adapted to this environment without theatrical adjustment. He shared proximity to the troops, reviewed patrol reports, and met with commanders daily. He did not present himself as a heroic conqueror. He presented himself as responsible authority. His clothing, though imperial in rank, remained practical for campaign conditions. The Marcomannic Wars, as they would later be called, unfolded over years rather than a single dramatic confrontation. Roman strategy emphasized containment and counterattack. Forts were reinforced. Supply lines secured. When necessary, legions crossed the Danube to disrupt tribal coalitions before they could consolidate. The Germanic tribes did not operate as a unified state. Leadership was decentralized. Roman diplomats attempted to negotiate with individual chieftains, offering subsidies or land arrangements in exchange for peace. Some agreements held briefly. Others dissolved under pressure from rival factions. Marcus's administrative mind approached war as extended problem-solving rather than sudden glory. He studied terrain maps. He reviewed intelligence from scouts. He balanced offensive maneuvers with defensive consolidation. The Danube region's climate demanded endurance. Winters were severe. Rivers froze. Movement slowed. Despite hardship, the Roman army retained structural advantages. Engineering units constructed bridges and temporary fortifications efficiently. Legionary training allowed coordinated maneuvering even under difficult conditions. Marcus ensured that pay was delivered reliably, understanding that morale depended partly on predictable compensation. The plague continued to affect troop strength intermittently. Replacement recruits required training. Veterans carried experience but also fatigue. Marcus rotated units when possible, though manpower constraints limited flexibility. He encouraged discipline through example rather than reprimand. Faustina's presence along the frontier reinforced stability. She supported families of soldiers and supervised charitable distributions. Her role earned respect among troops who saw the imperial household sharing their environment. Back in Rome, governance continued under appointed officials. The Senate cooperated in funding military campaigns. Grain distribution remained stable. The capital did not descend into panic, though news of frontier battles circulated steadily. Marcus spent increasing time writing during these campaigns. In spare moments within tents or temporary headquarters, he recorded reflections, reminders to act justly, to endure cold and discomfort without complaint, to accept the limits of control. These writings, never intended for publication, reveal the intersection of philosophy and lived strain. The frontier conflict gradually shifted momentum. By the early 170s, Roman forces regained initiative. Some tribal leaders sought negotiated settlement, others resisted. Marcus considered the possibility of establishing new provinces north of the Danube, though such plans required careful evaluation of sustainability. Military operations extended deep into tribal territory at times, demonstrating Roman capacity to project force despite earlier losses from plague. Yet Marcus avoided unnecessary expansion. Securing stable borders remained priority. The cost of prolonged warfare was measurable. Treasury reserves declined gradually. Recruitment demanded incentives. Agricultural regions near the frontier suffered disruption. Marcus balanced military necessity with fiscal caution. The emperor's physical endurance was tested. Campaign life exposed him to harsh weather, irregular sleep, and constant decision-making. Yet observers noted his composure. He did not indulge in anger toward defeated enemies nor excessive celebration of victory. In some cases, defeated tribes were relocated within imperial territory under supervision. Such policies aimed to stabilize border regions while integrating new populations gradually. These arrangements required administrative oversight to prevent future unrest. Communication between frontier and capital remained essential. Couriers rode along established routes. Written instructions maintained continuity of governance. Marcus's dual-role military commander and civil administrator required sustained attention. As years passed, the Danube conflict defined the middle period of his reign. The philosopher emperor who had once observed Antoninus's calm administration now governed amid persistent strain. Yet the empire did not fracture. Institutions adapted. The pressure along the Danube revealed both vulnerability and resilience. Rome's borders were permeable, but its response was coordinated. Marcus's steady leadership, grounded in habits formed decades earlier, prevented reactive overreach. By the mid-170s, Roman forces achieved significant stabilization. Fortifications strengthened. Negotiations concluded with selected tribal groups. The immediate threat to Italy receded. Marcus remained attentive. He understood that frontier stability was never permanent. The Danube would require vigilance long after individual campaigns concluded. The emperor's life had shifted permanently from Rome's marble forums to frontier encampments. His daily routine blended military oversight with philosophical discipline. The empire, though scarred by plague and war, endured. Winters in the war camps. By the time the Marcomannic Wars settled into long campaigns rather than sudden invasions, Marcus Aurelius had grown accustomed to life far from Rome's paved streets and orderly forums. The Danube frontier was no longer an emergency posting. It was the centre of imperial decision-making. Years passed not in marble halls, but in timber-built headquarters and fortified encampments pressed against forests and riverbanks. Winter along the Danube reshaped everything. The river stiffened under ice. Supply wagons moved cautiously over frozen ground. Soldiers wrapped themselves in layered wool and heavy cloaks, their breath visible in the morning air. Fires burned continuously within camps, consuming wood cut from nearby forests. Discipline remained intact, but comfort was limited. Marcus did not insulate himself from these conditions. His quarters were larger than those of ordinary soldiers, but they were not luxurious. A writing table, a bed, storage chests, and a brazier defined his living space. He rose early, often before sunrise, reviewing reports brought in by guards or officers who had spent the night monitoring patrol routes. The army's structure remained systematic even in winter. Centurions supervised training exercises when weather allowed. Engineers inspected fortifications for weaknesses caused by frost. Physicians monitored outbreaks of illness, which sometimes increased during colder months. The emperor moved among these systems with familiarity rather than ceremony. Food in the camps was practical. Soldiers relied on grain rations, dried meat, legumes, and occasional fresh supplies delivered from nearby settlements. Marcus ate simply, maintaining habits of moderation learned in youth. Excess would have been impractical in such conditions, and he did not seek it. Winter also brought extended periods of relative stillness between campaigns. During these quieter intervals, Marcus wrote more frequently. The reflections that would later be known as the Meditations took shape in these camps. They were not essays prepared for an audience. They were reminders to himself, to wake ready for duty, to accept criticism calmly, to remember that discomfort does not diminish virtue. He wrote about the inevitability of change, about the briefness of human life, about the importance of justice. These were not abstract musings detached from reality. They were exercises practiced amid cold wind and uncertain supply lines. Philosophy here was not performance, it was maintenance of composure. The soldiers observed him closely. An emperor who shared the frontier environment signaled commitment. He inspected defensive lines personally. He listened to commanders' assessments without impatience. He authorized repairs and reinforcements as needed. When casualties occurred, he acknowledged loss without dramatization. Across the river, tribal movements continued. Some winters brought temporary quiet, others saw renewed skirmishes. Intelligence gathering remained constant. Scouts monitored crossings. Negotiators maintained contact with allied groups. Marcus's relationship with his officers was grounded in respect. He relied on experienced generals who understood terrain and tribal politics. While ultimate authority rested with him, he did not disregard counsel. The Roman military tradition valued hierarchy, but it also valued competence. The presence of relocated tribes within imperial territory required oversight. Some groups were settled as agricultural communities under supervision, contributing labour and serving as buffer populations. Integrating them demanded coordination between military and civil administrators. Marcus reviewed policies carefully to prevent future instability. Beyond military matters, administrative tasks persisted. Legal appeals from provinces reached the frontier. Financial assessments required signature. The emperor's seal travelled north with him. Governance did not pause because of geography. Winters also magnified the human cost of prolonged conflict. Soldiers longed for families left in distant provinces. Letters travelled slowly. News of deaths from plague or local unrest filtered into camps months after events occurred. Marcus understood that morale depended not only on pay, but on connection to home. Faustina joined him on some campaigns, reinforcing continuity of imperial presence. Her support for soldiers' families extended beyond Rome. She distributed assistance to widows and children of fallen troops. Her health, however, began to show strain from repeated travel and exposure. In 175 AD, news reached Marcus of a serious political disruption in the east. Avidius Cassius, a respected general, had declared himself emperor after false reports of Marcus's death circulated. The rebellion was brief. Cassius was killed by his own officers before Marcus reached Syria, yet the incident revealed the fragility of loyalty during prolonged campaigns. Marcus responded with restraint. He did not pursue widespread reprisals. Instead, he restored order methodically, emphasizing continuity rather than vengeance. His response reinforced his reputation for measured leadership. Returning to the Danube after addressing the eastern disruption, Marcus resumed winter campaigns with renewed focus. The frontier conflict required sustained attention. Fortifications expanded into more permanent structures. Plans for possible provincial organisation north of the river were evaluated, though never fully realised. The cumulative years of frontier life altered Marcus physically. Exposure to harsh climate and continuous strain weakened his health gradually, yet he maintained routine. He wrote daily. He reviewed troop readiness. He inspected supply inventories. Winter camps fostered a rhythm of reflection. Without the distractions of Rome's ceremonies, Marcus confronted his own thoughts more directly. He examined impatience when it arose. He reminded himself that leadership required endurance beyond comfort. The Roman army's resilience during these winters demonstrated institutional strength. Despite plague losses and extended deployment, the legions remained organized. Discipline, reinforced over centuries, provided stability. As the 170s progressed, Roman forces regained firm control along key sections of the Danube. Tribal coalitions fractured under sustained pressure. Negotiated settlements reduced immediate threat. Marcus considered long-term border realignment, but approached such plans cautiously. The emperor's winters in the war camps became emblematic of his reign, not for dramatic battles alone, but for steady persistence. He governed an empire not from a throne elevated above discomfort, but from within the same cold air that hardened his soldiers. The philosopher who once studied self-control in Rome's quiet courtyards now practiced it amid frost and fatigue. His writings from these camps reveal neither self-pity nor triumphalism. They reveal repetition. Rise, review, decide, endure. The Danube frontier did not yield quickly, but it did stabilize gradually. Marcus's presence there signaled commitment that could not be misinterpreted. By the late 172nd, after years of winter campaigns, the empire's northern defences stood reinforced. The cost had been significant lives lost, resources spent, years of personal strain, but coherence endured. Marcus Aurelius had become inseparable from the frontier. The winters had shaped him as surely as his youth under Antoninus. His leadership was no longer theoretical preparation. It was lived experience under cold skies. Stoicism in practice. By the middle years of his reign, Marcus Aurelius no longer needed to imagine adversity in order to train his character. Adversity had become the climate in which he governed. War along the Danube, the lingering waves of plague, the strain on treasury and manpower, the brief but unsettling rebellion of Avidius Cassius, these were not abstract challenges. They were daily realities. And within them, his philosophical commitments moved from study to habit. Stoicism, as Marcus had learned it in youth, did not promise comfort. It did not claim that virtue would prevent suffering. It insisted only that the mind retains authority over its judgments. Events occur, response is chosen. In the frontier camps and provincial headquarters, Marcus practiced this distinction repeatedly. His mornings began before formal duties. Even in cold quarters, he forced himself to rise promptly. In one of his notes, he reminded himself that he was not made to lie in bed wrapped in blankets, but to do the work of a human being. The thought was practical, not theatrical. A delayed start meant delayed decisions, and delay in wartime carried consequences. Administrative tasks continued without interruption. Appeals from citizens reached him through layers of officials. Land disputes in Asia Minor, inheritance questions in Gaul, tax adjustments in North Africa all required signature and review. Marcus refused to allow the frontier to sever him from civil governance. His role was not merely military commander, it was custodian of the empire's legal coherence. He worked with jurists to refine aspects of Roman law, particularly regarding the treatment of slaves and guardianship of minors. Though not revolutionary, his reforms leaned toward fairness within established frameworks. He strengthened protections for orphans and clarified procedures for manumission. These legal refinements reflected his belief that justice must operate consistently, even when war consumed attention elsewhere. Stoicism influenced his approach to anger. Frontier conflict inevitably produced frustration. Tribal leaders sometimes broke negotiated agreements. Officers occasionally disagreed over strategy. Supply chains faltered in harsh weather. Marcus reminded himself that irritation accomplishes nothing. When provoked, he examined his reaction before speaking. This restraint earned respect among commanders accustomed to volatile authority in other contexts. He also applied philosophical discipline to praise. Victories against the Marcomanni and Quadi brought commendations from the Senate and public declarations of gratitude. Titles such as Germanicus were awarded to him. Yet in private notes, he warned himself not to attach identity to a claim. Reputation, he wrote, depends on the opinions of others, and opinions shift. During extended campaigns, Marcus continued to write in Greek, the language of philosophy he preferred for personal reflection. His entries were brief, often fragments. They reminded him that death is natural, that fame fades, that virtue lies in present action. These sentences were tools, not literature. The death of Faustina in 175 AD tested his stoic composure deeply. She had accompanied him on campaign and died in Cappadocia, likely from illness. Marcus arranged for her deification through the Senate, a customary honour for empresses. He founded charitable institutions in her name to support orphaned girls. Publicly, he maintained order. Privately, the loss was profound. Yet even here, his writings emphasized acceptance. Nature gives and takes according to its course. Raising Commodus now assumed increased importance. The boy, born into imperial succession, grew amid war and ceremony. Marcus appointed tutors and involved him gradually in administrative observation. In 177 AD, Commodus was elevated to co-emperor, a decision that would later draw scrutiny. At the time, it signalled continuity during prolonged frontier engagement. Marcus sought to secure succession clearly, rather than leave ambiguity. Stoicism also shaped his view of enemies. He did not frame Germanic tribes as inherently inferior or malicious. In his notes, he reminded himself that they act according to their understanding, just as Romans act according to theirs. Conflict arises from circumstance and perception. Such perspective did not weaken military resolve. It tempered cruelty. In the camps, discipline extended beyond battle. Marcus enforced standards of conduct. Looting without authorization was prohibited. Civilians within imperial territory were to be protected when possible. Justice, even in war, reinforced legitimacy. The economic strain of sustained campaigning required careful management. Marcus authorized the sale of imperial possessions, ornaments, and luxury items from the palace to support military funding. This gesture signaled shared sacrifice. It also reflected his personal indifference toward material excess. Medical challenges persisted, though the worst waves of plague had passed by the late 170s, outbreaks recurred. Physicians like Galen travelled between Rome and frontier zones. Galen's detailed observations contributed to medical understanding, though effective treatment remained limited. Marcus himself experienced bouts of illness, likely aggravated by exposure and stress. His philosophical commitment did not prevent fatigue. It structured his response to it. He wrote about accepting bodily weakness without resentment, about distinguishing between physical sensation and moral failure. Pain did not equal injustice. It required management. Public perception of Marcus during these years solidified around the image of the philosopher king. Statues depicted him with a beard, reflecting Greek intellectual style rather than traditional Roman austerity. The equestrian statue, later preserved in Rome, captures composure rather than aggression. His outstretched hand suggests measured command. Within the Senate, his relationship remained cooperative. He respected institutional forms, consulted advisors, and avoided humiliating opponents. Even after the rebellion of Avidius Cassius, he chose clemency over widespread punishment. Such restraint reinforced trust. His daily meals remained modest. Bread, vegetables, and occasional meat sustained him. Wine was consumed in moderation. He avoided indulgence not as spectacle, but as habit. As Commodus matured, Marcus involved him more visibly in military review. The young co-emperor observed troop formations and administrative hearings. Whether he internalized his father's discipline remained uncertain, but Marcus persisted in guidance. By 178 AD, renewed pressure along the Danube required further campaigns. Marcus, now aging and physically worn, returned north once more. His health showed signs of strain, likely chronic illness, compounded by years of exposure, yet he continued to lead personally rather than delegate entirely. Stoicism in practice did not remove uncertainty. It provided framework. Marcus faced each new challenge with the same principles he had studied as a young man under Antoninus. Act justly. Accept what lies beyond control. Focus on present duty. His writings from these later campaigns carry a tone of repetition, not despair. He reminded himself daily that he would meet ungrateful, dishonest, or hostile individuals. Yet he resolved to meet them with patience. Such repetition reveals ongoing effort rather than effortless calm. The empire, though scarred by plague and war, remained intact. Roads functioned, grain shipments resumed regularity, provinces continued trade. Marcus's steady governance prevented fragmentation during prolonged stress. He did not present himself as invulnerable. He acknowledged fear and fatigue in private reflection, but he did not allow them to dictate policy. Stoicism, for Marcus Aurelius, was not retreat from responsibility, it was reinforcement of it. The philosopher did not withdraw from war. He endured it. He did not deny grief. He accepted it without surrendering clarity. As he entered the final years of his reign, his body weakened, but his habits remained constant. The Danube frontier demanded one more sustained effort. Commodus stood beside him as co-emperor. The empire looked to the aging ruler, whose authority rested less on spectacle than on consistency. The winters had hardened him. The plague had tested him. The rebellion had unsettled him. Yet through each phase he returned to the same discipline. Govern the self, then govern the state. Rome without him. While Marcus Aurelius spent long years along the Danube frontier, the city of Rome continued without his daily physical presence. Emperors before him had ruled from the capital, appearing regularly in the Forum, presiding in the Senate, attending games, and conducting ceremonies before vast crowds. Marcus, by contrast, governed for extended periods from military headquarters hundreds of miles away. Yet Rome did not drift into disorder. It adjusted. The administration of the capital relied on layers of officials whose roles had been refined over generations. The urban prefect maintained public order. The grain prefect supervised the annona, ensuring shipments from Africa and Egypt reached the warehouses at Ostia and then moved up the Tiber. Magistrates oversaw markets, sanitation, and building maintenance. Marcus corresponded steadily with these officials, issuing instructions and reviewing reports. Distance required trust, but not absence of oversight. The Roman populace had long been accustomed to emperors who travelled. Hadrian had spent much of his reign visiting provinces. Yet Marcus's prolonged frontier presence coincided with visible strain plague, rising military expenditure, and rumours from the north. Citizens relied on written proclamations and official messengers to understand events. Coinage served as both economic tool and communication medium. New issues depicted victories along the Danube, symbols of stability, and images of Commodus alongside Marcus, reinforcing continuity. The circulation of coins carrying imperial likeness reminded distant provinces that governance persisted even when the emperor stood far from the Forum. Life in Rome retained its rhythm. The baths opened each afternoon. Markets sold fish brought from coastal waters, vegetables from nearby estates, and imported goods from Spain and Syria. Bakers prepared bread from grain distributed through the annona system. The city's aqueducts continued to channel water into fountains and homes. The Senate, meeting in the Curia, handled legislative matters and debated military funding. Though ultimate authority rested with the emperor, senatorial cooperation remained essential. Marcus's respectful approach to the Senate during earlier years ensured continued collaboration. He did not humiliate or marginalize the body. As a result, while he campaigned, it remained aligned rather than resentful. Public entertainments continued intermittently. Chariot races at the Circus Maximus remained popular. Gladiatorial games occurred, though Marcus himself was known to disapprove of excessive brutality. He did not abolish them. Tradition was deeply rooted, but he avoided lavish expansion of such spectacles during periods of strain. The plague left visible marks on Rome's demographics. Some insulae, crowded apartment blocks housing the urban poor, lost tenants. Skilled craftsmen became scarcer. Estate managers reported difficulty securing reliable labour, yet migration from rural areas and provinces partially offset population decline. The city remained crowded and active. Religious life persisted with intensity. Temples conducted rituals seeking divine favour for the emperor and the army. Priests interpreted omens. Foreign cults gained followers among those seeking personal reassurance. Marcus did not suppress these movements aggressively. His philosophical outlook allowed space for varied expressions of belief so long as public order remained intact. Commodus, elevated as co-emperor in 177 AD, began to appear more prominently in Rome during intervals when Marcus was absent. As a young ruler, he participated in ceremonies and games, projecting vigour and continuity. For citizens, the presence of an imperial figure in the city reinforced stability. Marcus likely understood the importance of this visibility and permitted Commodus to cultivate public familiarity. The city's infrastructure required constant maintenance. Fires occasionally damaged neighbourhoods. Repair crews rebuilt structures swiftly. Public works projects initiated under earlier emperors continued, though large new monuments were limited due to financial priorities directed toward frontier campaigns. Legal appeals from Rome's citizens continued to reach Marcus through official channels. Disputes over inheritance, property boundaries, and contracts were reviewed and decided. Though physically distant, he remained legally present. Economic adjustments reflected military expenditure. Treasury reserves accumulated under Antoninus had been drawn upon for war and epidemic relief. Marcus avoided severe debasement of currency, though some adjustments occurred. Stability of coinage remained crucial to commercial trust. Merchants operating along Mediterranean trade routes experienced fluctuation in demand, but not collapse. Rome's vast network of ports and roads preserved economic cohesion. Provincial cities remained integrated into imperial commerce. Letters from the frontier describing victories or setbacks were read publicly at times to reassure citizens. Announcements of successful negotiations along the Danube reduced anxiety. Conversely, reports of renewed incursions prompted prayers and cautious anticipation. The absence of the emperor from daily urban life altered the city's atmosphere subtly. Marcus's philosophical seriousness had never lent itself to theatrical appearances. His absence was not felt as spectacle lost, but as quiet responsibility relocated. Senators and equestrians stepped into visible administrative roles. Civic elites funded local festivals and infrastructure repairs, reinforcing their loyalty to imperial authority. Patronage networks continued functioning. In some circles, the prolonged wars prompted reflection on Rome's future. Older citizens remembered decades of calm under Antoninus and Hadrian. Younger generations had known only conflict and plague, yet no organised movement challenged imperial authority. Marcus's legitimacy, grounded in adoption lineage and measured governance, remained secure. Within the imperial residences on the Palatine Hill, staff maintained daily routines. Rooms were cleaned. Archives preserved correspondence. Statues were polished. Though the emperor's physical presence was intermittent, the household functioned as symbol of continuity. When Marcus returned to Rome between campaigns, he resumed public duties without dramatic display. He attended Senate meetings, reviewed urban administration, and participated in religious ceremonies. His visits reinforced connection between frontier and capital. The city's mood during these years can best be described as resilient. Strain was acknowledged, but panic did not dominate. Rome had endured fires, conspiracies, and previous epidemics. Its institutions were accustomed to adaptation. Marcus's governance style, emphasizing steadiness rather than flamboyance, proved well suited to this period. He did not rely on constant presence to maintain authority. He relied on systems. As the Danube campaigns progressed toward relative stabilization in the late 172nd, Rome adjusted to the rhythm of imperial absence and return. Commodus's growing visibility in the capital signaled impending generational transition. Yet beneath surface continuity, subtle shifts were occurring. A generation raised during war and plague would not necessarily mirror the calm stability of Antoninus's era. Economic and demographic changes would influence future decades. For now, Rome without Marcus remained Rome. Vast, organized, layered in hierarchy and tradition. The city's daily life continued, vendors calling out prices, senators debating quietly, children learning letters in shaded courtyards. Marcus Aurelius governed from afar, not through absence, but through correspondence, law, and institutional continuity. His physical distance did not dissolve imperial coherence. The philosopher emperor, shaped by frontier winters, maintained Rome's order even when snow covered the banks of the Danube. The capital endured not because he stood constantly within it, but because he had learned long ago that governance rests in systems, not spectacle. Faustina's final years. As the wars along the Danube stretched across seasons, and the empire adjusted to the long shadow of plague, the personal world of Marcus Aurelius narrowed in ways that no frontier report could measure. Faustina the Younger, his wife for more than 3 decades, had shared the shifting geography of his reign, from Rome's structured ceremonies to the rough encampments along the northern rivers. In her final years, her presence became both steadier and more fragile. Faustina had been born into imperial expectation. As the daughter of Antoninus Pius, she understood the language of authority from childhood. Her marriage to Marcus had not been a romantic union in the modern sense. It had been arranged to secure succession and continuity, yet over time, familiarity deepened into partnership. She bore him many children, at least 13 by most counts, though the survival of only a handful shaped their household with alternating hope and grief. During the height of the Marcomannic campaigns, Faustina accompanied Marcus to the eastern provinces and later toward the Danube. Her presence among troops was not decorative. Roman military culture valued visible imperial solidarity. By travelling with the emperor, she reinforced the image of shared sacrifice. Soldiers' families received support under her supervision. Charitable distributions in her name extended beyond Rome to provincial towns. In 175 AD, while travelling through Cappadocia in Asia Minor, after the brief rebellion of Avidius Cassius had been suppressed, Faustina fell ill. The exact nature of her illness remains uncertain. Ancient accounts vary, sometimes coloured by rumour. What is clear is that her health deteriorated rapidly. In the unfamiliar climate of the Anatolian plateau, far from Rome's accustomed environment, she died. For Marcus, the loss occurred amid ongoing military responsibility. There was no extended period for withdrawal. Administrative tasks required continuation. Campaign coordination resumed almost immediately. Yet the absence of her presence marked a private shift. For decades, Faustina had embodied the domestic core of imperial life. Now, that space stood altered. Marcus responded according to Roman custom. He petitioned the Senate for her deification, a standard honour for empresses who had upheld their role with dignity. Temples were dedicated in her name. Coins were struck, bearing her image alongside divine symbols. The title Divine Faustina circulated across provinces, reinforcing both reverence and continuity. He also founded charitable institutions, particularly for orphaned girls in her memory. These foundations provided financial assistance for dowries and education, ensuring that her legacy extended into social welfare. Such acts were both commemorative and practical, reflecting his belief that honour should produce tangible benefit. The court adjusted. Servants who had served Faustina were reassigned or dismissed. Household routines reorganized. The younger children, especially Commodus and his siblings, experienced their mother's absence in daily rhythms, meals, instruction, ceremony. Tutors assumed additional roles. Marcus remained attentive to their education, though he could not replace maternal presence. Rumours circulated in some circles regarding Faustina's conduct during her life. Certain ancient writers suggested infidelity or excessive indulgence, though these accounts are difficult to verify and often reflect later political agendas. Marcus did not publicly engage with such accusations. His actions following her death indicate respect and loyalty rather than resentment. The empire at large responded to the empress's death with formal mourning. Public ceremonies acknowledged her status. Statues and inscriptions commemorated her. In Rome, citizens observed ritual expressions of grief customary for imperial family members. For Marcus, philosophical discipline intersected with personal sorrow. In his private writings, he reminded himself that all relationships are subject to nature's course. Attachment must coexist with acceptance. These reflections were not attempts to suppress feeling, but to prevent it from distorting duty. His own health during this period showed signs of strain. Years of campaign life had weakened him. Illness visited intermittently. Galen, the prominent physician, would later describe treating the emperor for recurring ailments. Whether these included chronic digestive issues or other conditions remains debated, but the cumulative toll of stress and exposure was visible. The death of Faustina also shifted the symbolic balance within the imperial household. Commodus, now a young man, occupied greater public space. His elevation as co-emperor in 177 AD reinforced this transition. Marcus may have intended to secure stability by clarifying succession during his lifetime. Yet this decision would later shape Rome's trajectory in ways he could not fully anticipate. The frontier campaigns continued. Marcus returned to the Danube after addressing eastern unrest and overseeing Faustina's memorial arrangements. War did not pause for grief. Germanic tribes tested Roman defences anew. Fortifications required reinforcement. Negotiations resumed. In the camps, the emperor's routine remained consistent. He rose early, reviewed reports, and wrote reflections. Yet those close to him likely observed subtle change. The long companionship of marriage had ended. His inner world grew more solitary. Rome, distant from the frontier, absorbed news of the empress's death within broader patterns of adaptation. Life in the capital continued, markets reopened each morning. Senate debates persisted. Religious rituals unfolded. The empire's scale allowed personal loss to coexist with institutional continuity. Marcus's leadership style did not shift toward harshness or indulgence after Faustina's death. He maintained measured governance. Clemency remained part of his policy. Legal reforms continued incrementally. Military discipline remained firm, but not excessive. The charitable institutions founded in Faustina's name demonstrated his belief that personal memory should translate into public good. The provision of dowries for girls from modest backgrounds strengthened social stability and reflected concern for vulnerable citizens. As the 170s progressed toward their close, the empire's condition showed gradual stabilization along the Danube. Yet Marcus's physical strength declined steadily. His beard, long associated with philosophical identity, grayed. Lines of fatigue deepened across his face. The final years of Faustina's life had coincided with the most demanding period of his reign. Her death marked not only personal bereavement, but the closing of a chapter rooted in the calmer world of Antoninus. The partnership that began in youth under imperial succession plans had endured war, plague, and rebellion. Marcus did not publicly dwell on loss. He integrated it into his understanding of impermanence. The stoic discipline he had practiced for decades provided language and structure for grief. Nature gives, nature takes, virtue lies in response. As he prepared for renewed campaigns north of the Danube, the imperial household stood reshaped. Commodus, now co-ruler, would increasingly share responsibility. Faustina's memory persisted in temples and charitable foundations, but not in daily council. The question of succession. By the late 170s, Marcus Aurelius had spent nearly 2 decades as emperor, much of that time in motion between frontier and province. The empire had endured plague, sustained warfare, and internal unrest without collapsing. Yet beneath the visible pressures of war lay another matter that demanded quiet resolution: succession. Rome's stability had often depended not only on the strength of a reigning emperor, but on the clarity with which his successor was recognized. Marcus himself had not been born into direct imperial succession. He had been selected, adopted, and prepared. His legitimacy rested on deliberate choice and careful training. His son Commodus stood in a different position. Born in 161 AD, the same year Marcus became emperor, Commodus represented hereditary continuity. He had grown up amid imperial ceremony and military encampments, aware from early childhood that he occupied a central place in Rome's future. The decision to elevate Commodus to co-emperor in 177 AD was both practical and symbolic. Practically, it ensured that in the event of Marcus's death during campaign, authority would pass smoothly without dispute. Symbolically, it marked a shift from the adoptive succession model of the so-called 5 good emperors toward dynastic inheritance. Marcus had observed the benefits of adoptive selection. Hadrian had chosen Antoninus Pius. Antoninus had adopted Marcus and Lucius Verus. Each transition prioritized perceived capability over bloodline. Yet Marcus did not repeat that model. Whether from paternal confidence, political calculation, or exhaustion with prolonged instability, he chose his son. Commodus's education had been structured carefully. Tutors instructed him in rhetoric, law, and philosophy. He accompanied Marcus on military campaigns, observing troop formations and administrative hearings. As a young boy, he had been presented to the public during ceremonies, reinforcing his image as heir. However, temperament cannot be molded entirely by instruction. Contemporary observers noted differences between father and son. Marcus valued restraint, introspection, and discipline. Commodus displayed greater interest in spectacle and physical display. Youthful confidence, common in heirs raised within privilege, sometimes overshadowed patience. Marcus likely recognized these differences, yet he also understood that succession ambiguity could invite civil conflict. The brief rebellion of Avidius Cassius in 175 AD had demonstrated how quickly rumour could destabilize loyalty. By elevating Commodus clearly during his own lifetime, Marcus removed uncertainty. The Senate confirmed Commodus as co-emperor without open resistance. Coins were struck bearing their joint images. Public ceremonies displayed father and son side by side. The image of continuity reassured citizens weary from years of crisis. Within the imperial household, Commodus's role expanded. He presided over select administrative duties under supervision. He appeared before the Senate and military units. Marcus remained primary authority, but transition had begun. The broader Roman world observed this generational shift with cautious optimism. Dynastic succession offered predictability. Provinces distant from Rome valued clarity. Governors required confidence that orders would not shift abruptly upon a ruler's death. Marcus continued to lead campaigns along the Danube even after Commodus's elevation. The young co-emperor accompanied him north in 178 AD. Frontier life exposed Commodus to military reality, harsh winters, disciplined camps, strategic negotiation, yet not all lessons of austerity take root equally. Commodus's exposure to camp life did not erase his inclination toward display. Reports from the period suggest he preferred ceremonial participation to administrative review. Marcus may have hoped that proximity to responsibility would deepen maturity. The question of succession extended beyond personality. It involved structural continuity. Marcus ensured that key advisors would remain in place during transition. Experienced generals and administrators formed a network capable of guiding a young emperor. The empire at this stage had regained relative stability along the Danube. Negotiations with tribal groups reduced immediate threat. Fortifications stood reinforced. Marcus considered the possibility of establishing new provinces north of the river, though such plans required sustained commitment. His own health, however, declined gradually. Years of strain, exposure, and likely chronic illness weakened him. Galen's medical observations later referenced the emperor's resilience despite recurring symptoms. Marcus understood that time was limited. He did not convene dramatic councils to debate alternative heirs. His decision had been made. Commodus would inherit. The contrast between adoptive merit and hereditary succession has occupied historians for centuries. Yet within Marcus's lifetime, the choice reflected context. Prolonged crisis may have narrowed perceived options. Trust in bloodline could appear safer than renewed selection amid instability. Public reaction in Rome remained outwardly calm. The city's institutions continued functioning. Grain distributions remained steady. Trade routes recovered from earlier disruption. Citizens observed father and son in joint ceremonies, interpreting this as stability secured. Marcus's private reflections during these years suggest awareness of impermanence rather than grand design. He reminded himself that future generations would judge events differently. His task was not to control distant outcomes, but to act justly in present circumstance. As Commodus approached adulthood, he developed interest in physical contests and public spectacle. While not yet dominant in policy, these tendencies signaled divergence from his father's austere style. Marcus did not suppress them forcefully. Whether from philosophical acceptance or paternal reluctance, he maintained measured guidance rather than harsh correction. The army acknowledged Commodus formally. Loyalty oaths included his name. This integration reduced risk of contested command upon transition. Military support was crucial. Legions stationed along the Danube had come to respect Marcus's endurance. Their allegiance to his son would determine continuity. In the capital, statues and inscriptions reflected the generational shift. Artisans depicted Commodus with youthful features beside his bearded father. The visual pairing conveyed balance between experience and renewal. The question of succession, though resolved administratively, lingered in subtler ways. Would Commodus embody the discipline required to sustain an empire shaped by war and plague? Could dynastic inheritance match the deliberate adoptive model that had preceded it? Marcus likely considered these questions privately, yet his philosophy emphasized action over speculation. He prepared the structures he could influence and accepted the rest as beyond immediate control. As the frontier campaigns entered their final phase, Marcus's attention balanced between concluding military objectives and ensuring smooth transfer of authority. The empire, though still vast and complex, stood more stable than at the height of epidemic and invasion. The philosopher emperor who had been chosen in youth now approached the end of his reign with his own son beside him. Succession, once arranged by adoption, would now proceed by bloodline. Whether this decision would strengthen or strain Rome lay beyond his remaining years. Return to the front. In the closing years of the 170s, Marcus Aurelius returned once more to the Danube frontier, though by now his body bore the evidence of long service. His hair had thinned and greyed, his face had grown leaner, and bouts of illness interrupted his strength more frequently. Yet he did not relinquish command. The frontier, stabilized but not pacified, required sustained presence. After the brief rebellion of Avidius Cassius and the death of Faustina, Marcus might have chosen to remain in Rome and delegate northern operations to trusted generals. Instead, in 178 AD, he and Commodus travelled north together. The journey itself was long and deliberate. Imperial processions moved along established roads, stopping in provincial towns where officials presented petitions and reaffirmed loyalty. By the time Marcus reached the Danube region again, the military situation demanded renewed attention. Although earlier campaigns had secured temporary settlements with the Marcomanni and Quadi, tribal coalitions remained fluid. Migration pressures from farther east, possibly linked to movements of peoples beyond Rome's immediate horizon, destabilized earlier agreements. The Roman strategy shifted from reactive defense to more sustained control. Fortifications expanded, and in some cases Roman forces advanced north of the river to preempt future incursions. Engineers constructed roads and bridges to facilitate movement. Supply depots were reinforced to support longer operations. Marcus established headquarters near Vindobona, in the region corresponding to modern Vienna, and later at Sirmium and other strategic points. These were not temporary camps but semi-permanent military centres equipped to sustain prolonged presence. The emperor's quarters, though modest compared to Rome's palaces, were organised efficiently. A writing table stood beside official seals, maps of the region, and correspondence from the capital. Daily life resumed its frontier rhythm. Reports arrived from patrols before dawn. Officers reviewed troop readiness. Marcus met with commanders to discuss terrain and intelligence. Commodus, now formally co-emperor, observed and occasionally presided under guidance. The young ruler's exposure to direct command was intended to deepen his understanding of imperial responsibility. The Danube winters remained harsh. Snow accumulated along fortifications. Fires burned continuously within barracks. Soldiers wrapped themselves in heavy cloaks, and horses required careful sheltering. Supply lines stretched southward into Italy and eastward into the Balkans, requiring constant oversight. Marcus's health during these campaigns deteriorated gradually. Ancient sources suggest that he suffered from chronic ailments, possibly including stomach issues or recurring fevers. Galen's medical writings reference treating him for persistent conditions. Yet despite physical strain, Marcus maintained routine. He refused to retreat from responsibility prematurely. Military engagements during these years were not singular decisive battles but a series of coordinated maneuvers. Roman legions advanced into tribal territory, disrupted hostile gatherings, and negotiated surrenders. Some tribes accepted terms that required relocation or tribute. Others resisted until confronted by sustained force. Marcus considered establishing new provinces, Marcomannia and Sarmatia, north of the Danube, extending Roman administration deeper into Central Europe. Such expansion would have required permanent garrisons and civil infrastructure. Whether due to logistical constraints or declining health, these plans were never fully realized. Commodus's presence along the frontier was politically significant. Soldiers saw the continuity of command embodied in father and son together. Oaths of loyalty included both names. Marcus likely intended to solidify military allegiance to his heir while still alive. The empire at large observed this renewed campaign with cautious approval. Stability along the northern border meant protection for Italy and the Balkan provinces. The Senate supported funding measures, though financial strain remained evident. Marcus's leadership style did not shift toward aggression despite years of conflict. He maintained measured response, balancing force with negotiation. He avoided unnecessary cruelty toward surrendered tribes, preferring structured settlements that could integrate populations gradually. The administrative burden continued even in war. Legal appeals from distant provinces reached him at frontier headquarters. Decisions regarding taxation, inheritance, and municipal governance required signature. He delegated when appropriate, but remained ultimate authority. As the 170s drew toward their end, signs of gradual Roman advantage appeared. Key tribal leaders accepted terms. Border fortifications stood reinforced. Roman engineers improved defensive depth along the river, yet Marcus himself weakened. In early 180 AD, while stationed at Vindobona, he fell seriously ill. Accounts differ regarding the nature of his final illness. Some suggest plague recurrence, others imply chronic exhaustion, culminating in infection. Whatever the cause, his condition declined steadily. During these final weeks, Marcus reportedly summoned Commodus and advised him on governing with restraint and justice. Whether these conversations occurred exactly as later historians described, the transition itself proceeded without open conflict. Commodus stood ready as recognized co-emperor. The army, long accustomed to Marcus's presence, prepared for succession. Loyalty to Commodus would determine immediate stability. Oaths were renewed. Officers maintained order within camps. Marcus Aurelius died in March 180 AD at Vindobona. He was 58 years old. His body, according to Roman custom, was transported back to Rome for cremation and ceremonial rites. The Senate deified him, honouring his reign formally. The frontier campaigns he had sustained for over a decade did not collapse instantly upon his death. Yet the strategic vision he had considered further provincial expansion north of the Danube was soon abandoned by Commodus, who negotiated withdrawal and sought quicker peace. The return to the front in his final years encapsulated Marcus's approach to rule: presence over delegation, endurance over spectacle. Even as illness weakened him, he remained at the border rather than retreating to Rome's comfort. His death marked the end of a period historians would later describe as the close of the Pax Romana's most stable phase. The adoptive succession model that had produced rulers from Nerva to Marcus ended with him. Dynastic inheritance now defined Rome's future. Yet at the moment of his passing, the empire remained intact. Institutions functioned. Legions stood organized. Grain shipments continued. The philosopher who had governed through plague and war left behind not a shattered state, but a system still coherent. Marcus Aurelius had returned to the frontier one final time, not for glory, but for duty. His life closed where his most demanding years had unfolded, beneath the cold skies along the Danube, among soldiers who had come to see him not only as emperor, but as steady presence. Governing through strain, in the final decade of his life, as war and epidemic reshaped the empire's landscape, Marcus Aurelius governed not from a position of expanding abundance, but from careful recalibration. The treasury that Antoninus Pius had maintained with prudence had been drawn upon repeatedly to fund frontier campaigns, compensate for lost manpower, and stabilize provinces weakened by plague. Governing through strain required discipline as rigorous as commanding legions. Financial management stood at the center of this effort. Prolonged warfare along the Danube demanded consistent funding: soldiers' pay, supply contracts, engineering works, transportation networks. The Antonine Plague had reduced tax revenue in some provinces as agricultural production faltered and labour shortages persisted. Marcus resisted drastic increases in taxation, understanding that overburdened communities could destabilise loyalty. Instead, he turned to measured adjustments. Luxury items from the imperial palace ornaments, precious vessels, decorative furnishings were sold publicly to generate funds. This act, symbolic and practical, communicated shared sacrifice. If the emperor relinquished excess, citizens might accept necessary strain without resentment. Coinage policy required attention. The Roman monetary system, anchored in silver denarii and bronze coinage for daily trade, depended on trust in metal content. Marcus avoided severe debasement, though some reduction in silver purity occurred during his reign. He recognized that undermining currency stability could produce long-term economic damage. Grain distribution remained essential. The Annona system supplied Rome's urban population regularly. Disruption would risk unrest. Marcus ensured that maritime routes from Egypt to North Africa remained secure, even when plague affected port labourers. Harbour administrators coordinated unloading schedules carefully to prevent spoilage or delay. Provincial governance required close supervision. Governors were instructed to balance revenue collection with local stability. Appeals from cities seeking temporary tax relief due to plague-related losses were considered seriously. Marcus favoured moderation over rigid enforcement. The legal system continued functioning despite strain. Courts operated in Rome and provincial centres. Marcus personally reviewed significant cases, particularly those involving guardianship, property rights, and treatment of slaves. His legal philosophy emphasized fairness within established norms rather than sweeping reform. The army's structure also required adaptation. Recruitment expanded to include individuals previously excluded from service. In some instances, Enslaved persons were enlisted and later granted freedom upon completion of duty. Such measures, though unusual, reflected pragmatic response to manpower shortage. Infrastructure maintenance continued where possible. Roads linking provinces to frontier zones were repaired regularly. Aqueducts in Rome required oversight to ensure uninterrupted water supply. Public baths and markets, though occasionally affected by illness, reopened as outbreaks subsided. The Danube campaigns themselves imposed administrative burdens beyond battle. Relocated tribal groups required resettlement planning. Agricultural land, within imperial territory, was allocated under supervision to prevent disorder. These policies demanded coordination between military commanders and civil administrators. Marcus's correspondence during these years reveals constant balancing. Reports from Gaul described regional unrest linked to migration pressures. Governors in Asia Minor addressed local disputes influenced by economic fluctuation. Egypt's grain output required careful monitoring. Public morale remained a priority. Official announcements emphasized stability and victory without exaggeration. Religious ceremonies continued to reinforce communal identity. Marcus did not suppress public ritual. He understood its role in maintaining social cohesion. His personal habits reflected the broader theme of restraint. He maintained simple meals, moderate dress, and disciplined routine. His philosophical reflections, written amid strain, focused on endurance and justice rather than lamentation. Commodus's increasing visibility introduced generational contrast. The young co-emperor participated in public games and ceremonial appearances with greater enthusiasm than his father. Marcus did not openly challenge these inclinations, but remained attentive to administrative preparation. The economic strain of sustained campaigning gradually eased as frontier stability improved toward the end of the 172nd. Tribal settlements reduced immediate threat. Agricultural production in some provinces recovered from earlier plague waves. Trade resumed more consistent patterns. Yet, demographic shifts caused by the epidemic persisted. Population decline altered labour markets and military recruitment pools. Some estates consolidated under fewer landowners. Urban neighbourhoods reorganised as vacancies were filled gradually by migrants from rural regions. Marcus governed through these changes without radical restructuring. His approach favoured incremental adjustment over abrupt transformation. Stability depended on continuity. The Senate's cooperation remained strong. Marcus respected senatorial dignity and avoided public humiliation of political opponents. His clemency after Avidius Cassius's brief rebellion reinforced trust within elite circles. The imperial court, though often relocated to frontier headquarters, maintained administrative structure. Archives preserved correspondence. Financial accounts were recorded meticulously. Trusted advisors remained in service across years. Marcus's own health deteriorated gradually under accumulated strain. He experienced recurring illness, but continued to oversee governance actively. His ability to function amid physical weakness reinforced his philosophical conviction that bodily discomfort need not disrupt moral duty. As he approached the end of his reign, the empire, though changed, remained intact. Roads connected provinces, grain arrived in Rome, legions stood disciplined along fortified borders. The treasury, though diminished from Antoninus's abundance, was not exhausted. Governing through strain required neither dramatic reform nor theatrical resilience. It required daily attention, measured decision-making, and refusal to surrender coherence to panic. Marcus Aurelius did not restore the empire to the effortless calm of earlier decades. He preserved its structure through years that might have fractured a less disciplined administration. The philosopher who had studied self-control as a youth now applied it to fiscal policy, military recruitment, and public morale. The strain of his reign did not produce collapse. It produced adjustment. By the time illness confined him in early 180 AD, the empire he left behind was still functioning, not untouched by hardship, but not undone by it. Private habits of an emperor. Public memory often preserves emperors in marble posed in armour, hand extended in command, gaze fixed beyond the horizon. Yet Marcus Aurelius's authority rested less on posture than on pattern. Beneath the formal decisions, the decrees, the frontier campaigns, and the public ceremonies, there existed a quieter layer of repetition, the habits by which he ordered his own life. He rose early, regardless of season. Even during winters along the Danube, when frost gathered at the edges of tent fabric and smoke lingered in the cold air, he trained himself not to delay. One of his private reminders addressed this directly. When tempted to remain under blankets, he asked himself whether he had been born for comfort or for action. Rising was not symbolic, it was necessary. A delayed morning meant postponed decisions. His meals were consistent and moderate. Bread, vegetables, fruit, and occasional fish formed his regular fare. Wine was taken diluted, in Roman fashion, and rarely in excess. He did not use fasting or indulgence as displays of philosophical purity. He ate to sustain function. Even in Rome, when elaborate banquets could have been arranged at will, he maintained restraint. Clothing followed similar principle. As emperor, he wore garments appropriate to rank toga edged with purple, military cloak when in camp. Yet observers noted absence of ostentatious excess. Jewelry and ornamentation were minimal. He did not cultivate theatrical austerity, but neither did he invite spectacle. Reading occupied significant portions of his limited private time. Greek philosophical works remained constant companions. He revisited teachings of Epictetus, whose emphasis on inner discipline had influenced him deeply. He also read historians and poets, not for diversion alone, but for reflection on human conduct across generations. Writing, however, became his most distinctive private habit. In spare moments between councils, after reviewing reports, during pauses in campaign life, he wrote short entries to himself. These notes were not polished essays. They were reminders. Act justly. Do not be carried away by praise. Remember that death is natural. Do not allow anger to rule judgment. The physical act of writing grounded him. In frontier camps, a wooden table held wax tablets or parchment. In Rome, a similar surface in quieter chambers served the same purpose. The words were meant for no audience beyond himself. Their value lay in repetition. Sleep was taken when possible, but not guarded as sacred. Campaign life often interrupted rest. Messages arrived at night. Illness among troops required immediate response. He did not complain about shortened hours. He adjusted. He also practiced deliberate exposure to discomfort. As a youth, he had chosen to sleep on a simple pallet before his mother persuaded moderation. As emperor, he did not insist on luxurious quarters when travelling. This was not self-punishment. It was continuity of habit. Personal grooming remained orderly but not elaborate. The beard he wore, unusual among earlier emperors, aligned him visually with Greek philosophers. It was maintained without extravagance. Bathing, a central element of Roman hygiene, occurred regularly when facilities allowed, even in camps where temporary bath structures were erected for officers. Correspondence consumed significant time. Letters to provincial governors, military commanders, and legal officials required clarity. He dictated many responses, but he reviewed drafts carefully. Language mattered. A poorly phrased instruction could create confusion far from its origin. He also listened. When petitioners were admitted, he allowed them to present grievances without interruption. This habit, learned under Antoninus, reflected belief that authority must first hear before judging. Within the household, he maintained presence with his children when circumstances permitted. Education sessions occasionally included his attendance. He asked tutors about progress. Though distant frequently due to campaigns, he did not treat family as peripheral to duty. His relationship with Commodus during the young man's adolescence included measured guidance. Marcus did not attempt to reshape his son's temperament through force. He demonstrated routine instead. Whether example was sufficient would later prove uncertain. Physical exercise was not neglected. Military review required walking long distances, inspecting fortifications, and riding horseback. He remained active as long as health permitted. Activity sustained both authority and endurance. He avoided unnecessary luxury purchases. The sale of imperial ornaments during financial strain reflected not only fiscal necessity, but personal indifference toward display. Wealth, in his view, was tool rather than identity. Time alone was limited but valued. Even in crowded camps, he carved moments for reflection. He examined his reactions to irritation, fatigue, or praise. Self-scrutiny prevented accumulation of resentment. He practiced gratitude deliberately. In his notes, he listed qualities he appreciated in teachers, colleagues, and family members. This exercise reinforced humility. Medical treatment formed part of his routine in later years. Galen and other physicians advised dietary moderation and herbal remedies. Marcus followed prescriptions without dramatization. Illness was fact, not betrayal. He maintained respect for traditional religious observances, participating in rituals without fanaticism. Civic religion served social cohesion. He did not disrupt it. Even in conversation with generals, he avoided shouting or theatrical reprimand. Disagreement was handled through measured argument. Discipline was enforced, but without humiliation. As emperor, he possessed capacity to indulge impulse without immediate challenge. His private habits restrained that capacity. Authority did not tempt him toward spectacle, because repetition of discipline preceded power. In Rome, when present, he occasionally visited construction projects or public works to observe progress directly. Such inspections were practical rather than ceremonial. The rhythm of his life remained consistent across geography. Rise, review, decide, reflect. The environment shifted from marble halls to wooden palisades, but pattern endured. Private habits shaped public stability. An emperor prone to indulgence might destabilize administration subtly through inconsistency. Marcus's steadiness, though not dramatic, reinforced coherence. He did not see himself as extraordinary. In his notes, he reminded himself that emperors are mortal, that fame dissolves quickly. This perspective reduced attachment to position. His final years, marked by physical weakness, did not alter routine significantly. Even as illness advanced at Vindobona, he attempted to review reports and advise Commodus. The equestrian statue that later survived in Rome captures him mid-gesture, arm extended. Yet that gesture was supported by decades of small habits: early rising, moderate eating, measured speech, quiet writing. Marcus Aurelius governed not only through decrees and campaigns, but through repetition of discipline invisible to most citizens. His empire endured through strain, partly because he refused to abandon pattern when comfort vanished. Private habits formed the foundation upon which public authority rested. Without them, the philosopher emperor would have been merely another ruler facing plague and war. With them, he remained steady. Final illness at Vindobona. In the early months of 180 AD, the long campaigns along the Danube continued, though their intensity had lessened. Roman positions were reinforced. Tribal coalitions had been fragmented or subdued. The frontier did not promise permanent quiet, but it no longer trembled under immediate threat. It was in this relative stabilization, not in the chaos of invasion, that Marcus Aurelius's strength finally gave way. He was 58 years old. By Roman standards, this was not an unusually brief life, but it was a life marked by sustained strain. Years of exposure to harsh winters, repeated illness during plague outbreaks, long administrative hours, and emotional burdens had accumulated. In the camp at Vindobona, near the modern city of Vienna, he began to suffer from worsening symptoms. Ancient sources describe fever, weakness, and physical decline. Some later writers claim that plague returned to him personally. Others suggest chronic illness intensified beyond recovery. The exact diagnosis remains uncertain. What is clear is that his condition deteriorated steadily over days. Despite illness, he did not immediately withdraw from duty. Reports continued to arrive at headquarters. Officers sought instruction. Letters from Rome required acknowledgement. He reviewed what he could, conserving energy carefully. Galen was not present at Vindobona during his final illness, but other physicians attended him, applying treatments consistent with medical understanding of the time, herbal mixtures, dietary adjustments, and monitoring of symptoms. Commodus was present in camp. As co-emperor, he now stood at the threshold of sole authority. The army's loyalty to him had been cultivated over recent years, but the final transition required clarity. Marcus reportedly called for his son and spoke to him about responsibility. Ancient accounts differ on the content of these conversations, but they consistently portray Marcus urging restraint and discipline. The imperial camp maintained order. Guards remained at posts. Commanders coordinated routine patrols. The presence of an ailing emperor did not halt military structure. Roman discipline, reinforced over generations, continued functioning. As Marcus's strength declined further, he withdrew more fully into his quarters. Those close to him observed diminished appetite and increasing fatigue. He did not dramatize his suffering. His lifelong habit of distinguishing between bodily sensation and moral action remained evident. Pain was endured, not performed. News of his worsening condition spread quietly among officers. Oaths of loyalty were prepared to be reaffirmed upon his death. The army's cohesion depended on seamless transition. On March 17, 180 AD, Marcus Aurelius died at Vindobona. Accounts vary slightly on exact date, but the consensus places his death in that month. He died not in Rome's palaces, but in a frontier camp he had inhabited for years. The immediate response was procedural and respectful. Commodus assumed full imperial authority without open contest. Officers pledged loyalty. Messages were dispatched to Rome announcing the emperor's death and the succession. Marcus's body was prepared according to Roman custom. Temporary rites were performed in camp. Arrangements were made for transportation back to Rome for formal cremation and ceremony. The journey south carried not only remains but symbolic closure of an era. In Rome, the Senate decreed his deification. Statues were erected. Official mourning observed. The public recognized that a ruler who had governed through prolonged crisis had passed. Commodus, now sole emperor at 19, faced immediate decisions. One of his first major acts was to conclude peace negotiations with Germanic tribes and withdraw from planned territorial expansion north of the Danube. Where Marcus had contemplated establishing new provinces, Commodus favoured rapid stabilization and return to Rome. The army, though respectful of Commodus's authority, had grown accustomed to Marcus's steady presence. Transition required adjustment. Officers who had served under Marcus continued in their roles, providing continuity. The frontier campaigns gradually wound down. Legions repositioned. Fortifications remained, but large-scale offensive operations ceased. The empire Marcus left behind remained intact structurally. Institutions functioned. Treasury reserves, though reduced, were not empty. The legal system operated. Grain distribution continued. Yet subtle changes accompanied his death. The adoptive succession model that had produced stable transitions for nearly a century ended. Commodus represented hereditary continuity rather than deliberate selection. Marcus's final illness at Vindobona symbolized a reign defined by endurance rather than spectacle. He had not sought dramatic death in battle nor theatrical final proclamation. He had continued reviewing reports until strength failed. His writings, composed over years in camps and quiet chambers, survived as personal reflections rather than official doctrine. They would later circulate widely, shaping perceptions of him as philosopher king. The emperor who had been chosen in youth by adoption, trained under Antoninus, and tested by plague and war, died far from Rome's marble monuments. Yet the system he maintained carried his legacy forward. At Vindobona, under cold northern skies, Marcus Aurelius's life concluded in the same environment that had defined his middle years among soldiers, maps, and correspondence. His body would return to Rome, His reputation would endure beyond stone and coinage. But the man himself ended quietly, as he had lived, disciplined, restrained, and attentive to duty until the final days. Legacy of a philosopher king. When Marcus Aurelius died at Vindobona in 180 AD, the empire did not collapse, nor did it erupt in immediate upheaval. The transition to Commodus was orderly. Oaths were renewed. Messages travelled along established roads. The Senate in Rome confirmed the succession and decreed divine honours for the deceased emperor. Structurally, Rome continued, yet something quieter had shifted. Marcus had been the last ruler in a line often described, though not in his own time, as chosen for character rather than birth. From Nerva through Trajan, Hadrian, Antoninus Pius, and finally Marcus himself, adoption had been used as a mechanism to select heirs deemed capable. With Commodus, the pattern returned to hereditary succession. Whether Marcus believed that bloodline offered equal security, or whether prolonged crisis narrowed his perceived options, the result marked a change in imperial practice. In Rome, public mourning followed familiar forms. Statues were garlanded. Official decrees praised his justice and endurance. His body, returned from the frontier, was cremated according to imperial custom. Ashes were placed in the mausoleum of Hadrian. The Senate declared him divus divine, adding him formally to the ranks of deified emperors. Public memory began to shape itself quickly. Marcus was remembered not primarily as conqueror, though he had commanded legions for years. He was remembered as a ruler who had governed through difficulty without theatrical excess. The equestrian statue erected in his honour, later preserved by accident, when mistaken for a Christian emperor, captured calm command rather than aggression. The empire he left behind bore marks of his reign. Frontier defences along the Danube were reinforced and reorganised. Military recruitment policies had adapted to demographic loss from plague. Legal reforms clarified aspects of guardianship and slave treatment. Financial reserves, though strained, had been managed without collapse of currency. Yet the deeper legacy lay in something less visible, the survival of his private writings. The reflections he composed during winters in the camps were never intended for publication. They were written in Greek, likely for his own instruction alone. Short, direct reminders filled their pages. He wrote about the brevity of life, about the need to rise and act, about the futility of anger. He listed qualities he admired in teachers and colleagues. He cautioned himself against attachment to praise. These writings, later known as the Meditations, circulated after his death. Their preservation was not inevitable. They survived because scribes copied them, because readers found value in their clarity, because later generations sought guidance in a voice that spoke without ornament. For many centuries afterward, Marcus Aurelius would be remembered less for specific campaigns and more for the unusual combination of supreme political authority and inward philosophical discipline. The idea of the philosopher king, long imagined in Greek theory, had appeared in Roman reality. Commodus's reign, however, diverged sharply in tone. Where Marcus had preferred restraint, Commodus gravitated toward display. He participated in gladiatorial contests publicly, styled himself with theatrical titles, and shifted emphasis from frontier consolidation to personal spectacle. Administrative continuity remained initially, but over time, instability increased. Historians would later interpret Marcus's decision to elevate Commodus as a pivotal moment. Some would argue that the adoptive model should have continued. Others would note that historical circumstances rarely offer simple alternatives. Marcus governed through plague and war. His perspective on succession emerged from lived strain. In the provinces, daily life resumed its familiar patterns. Markets reopened fully as plague receded. Agricultural production stabilized gradually. Trade routes remained active. The empire's vastness absorbed transition. Military commanders who had served under Marcus continued their posts under Commodus. Fortifications along the Danube held. Negotiated settlements with tribal groups remained in effect for a time. The Senate, having cooperated closely with Marcus, adjusted to the style of the new emperor. Some tensions emerged gradually, but immediate continuity prevented crisis. Marcus's personal discipline left subtle imprint on administrative culture. His emphasis on measured judgment and clemency had reinforced trust among elites. His sale of imperial luxuries during financial strain had demonstrated shared burden. Centuries later, when political thinkers searched for examples of ethical leadership, Marcus Aurelius's name appeared regularly, not because he avoided conflict he had not, but because he confronted it without surrendering composure. His life illustrated that philosophy need not remain confined to classrooms. It could accompany military command and fiscal policy. It could shape daily habit as well as public decree. The Rome he inherited from Antoninus had been calm and prosperous. The Rome he left to Commodus had endured epidemic and sustained warfare. It was not as serene as before, but it remained unified. Marcus did not imagine himself as legend. In his own reflections, he reminded himself repeatedly that fame fades, that memory dissolves, that even emperors are temporary. This awareness tempered ambition. His legacy thus rests not only in institutional endurance, but in example. He demonstrated that power and introspection are not mutually exclusive, that authority can coexist with humility, that leadership under strain can rely on repetition of discipline rather than dramatic assertion. The marble statue in Rome, hand extended, survives while countless others have vanished. The meditations endure in printed pages long after the camps of Vindobona have disappeared. Marcus Aurelius's life unfolded between adoption and inheritance, between plague and stabilization, between frontier winters and Roman ceremony. He governed through strain without spectacle. When his ashes were placed among earlier emperors, Rome did not yet know how different the coming decades would feel. But it remembered, at least for a time, the steady ruler who had faced difficulty without losing balance. And in the quiet lines he left behind, written for himself in moments of fatigue and cold, generations would later find guidance that outlived his empire. Marcus Aurelius's world was one of roads stretching across continents, of legions marching through forests, of courtyards filled with measured conversation. It was also a world of private notebooks, simple meals, early mornings, and repeated reminders to remain steady. Imagine the Danube at dusk. The river moves slowly under fading light. Fortifications stand silent. Soldiers return to their tents. Somewhere inside a wooden structure, an emperor bends over a small tablet, writing a line meant only for himself. The empire he governed no longer exists. The marble halls have weathered. The camps have dissolved into earth. Yet the habit of rising early, of examining one's thoughts before acting, of meeting difficulty without surrendering judgment, these remain possible even now. Marcus Aurelius did not claim to master fate. He practiced mastering response. That practice carried him through plague, rebellion, and frontier war. As the centuries pass, his voice remains calm, almost quiet, reminding anyone who listens that power is brief, but character is chosen daily. The night deepens over Rome, over Vindobona, over every place his steps once crossed. Rest now with the image of a ruler who sought first to govern himself,